This happened on a road trip late last spring. I was taking a longer way back home after visiting some family, so I was driving around 4 hours each day to reach different spots. This was after the last stop on my list. The final 8 hours back home were just miles of forest and nothing else. I had been thinking about stopping by another town, but it was too far out of the way to make sense. From the place I'd stayed before, I left around 6:30 in the evening to head to the last Airbnb I'd booked, just a small cottage about 2 hours away. It was along my route back, which was the only reason I picked it. I figured it'd be a better choice than any cheap roadside hotel I might find on the way. The land around there was mostly flat, though there were trees scattered around here and there. When I pulled into the driveway of the place, it was clear someone had planted a row of tall pine trees in a straight line across the front yard. The gravel road split the line of trees right down the center and led to the front of the cabin. The outside of the place, combined with the quiet landscape, gave off a slightly creepy feeling. I parked, found the padlock, and used the code that had been emailed to me to unlock it. Even though the exterior was old and rough-looking, the inside had obviously been redone recently, probably just for short-term rentals. It was small but comfortable. I didn't bring much inside since it was just for one night. I sat at the little table inside and started eating the meal I'd grabbed from a fast food place earlier. Not even 10 minutes later, there was a knock on the front door. It startled me since I hadn't heard a vehicle pull up or any footsteps outside. I stood up and opened the door. A man around his mid-40s stood there with a black and gray beard and a shaved head. He said, smiling, "Hey, just wanted to stop by and make sure you got an okay and everything's all right." Realizing he must have been the host, I told him everything was fine and thanked him. I said goodnight and closed the door. I did think it was a bit strange for him to show up without warning just to ask if I was settled in. Maybe he lived nearby or maybe on another part of the land. One other thing that stuck out was the really strong smell coming off of him. It wasn't horrible, but he smelled like he'd been sweating outside all day. It just seemed a little off. I went back to the table, finished my food, and decided to take a quick shower before bed. I wasn't in there long, maybe 5 minutes, before I started feeling tired and figured I'd just lay down. After drying off, I got into bed and scrolled through my phone for a while. That's when I heard another knock at the door. It scared me just like the first one because, again, I hadn't heard any car or steps outside. It had to be the host again. But why? And why so soon after he'd already been there? Right away, I felt weird about it. I checked my phone but didn't see any message or missed call from him. I walked slowly into the main room, and the knocking continued. I stood there unsure of what to do. Finally, I spoke up and asked through the door what he wanted. He stopped knocking. "I just needed to ask you one more thing. Can you open up real quick?" he said. I didn't reply right away. I had no idea what to say. A few seconds later, he knocked again and asked if I could open the door. I told him it was late and I'd rather be left alone unless it was something important. After that, there was a long pause. The silence made my skin crawl. I waited a full minute, maybe more, and didn't hear him leave. No footsteps, no car, nothing. I started to wonder if he was still out there just standing. I tiptoed up to the door and looked through the little window in it. Nobody was there. Right away, I thought maybe he'd walked off quietly, but I should have heard the gravel crunching under his shoes if he had. So where did he go? I stood frozen for a bit, not sure what to do. The whole thing felt wrong. I didn't move, just stood still, listening. Then I happened to glance toward one of the living room windows. He was there. His eyes were locked onto mine through the glass. I panicked and ran straight to the bedroom, where I grabbed my phone and called 911. While I was on the phone, I heard the sound of the window being pushed up. He was trying to get in. That part made it even stranger. If this guy really was the host, wouldn't he have a key? That's when it all clicked. He wasn't the host at all. When the police got there, the man had already taken off. We had no clue which direction he ran. Later on, we managed to get in touch with the actual host and owner of the property. To this day, I have no idea what that guy's real plan was. Clearly, he had no business being there. I don't even want to think about what might have happened if I had opened the door that second time. I'm just thankful I didn't. I've lived in southern Arizona my whole life. If you know anything about Arizona, it's pretty diverse. The northern part is full of mountains and forests, while the southern part is much more city-like. This summer, I decided to take a trip to Flagstaff. It's a beautiful area and my first time visiting northern Arizona. I'll break this story into parts to keep it simple. Day 1 asterisk, I arrived at the cabin around 6 p.m. after a long 7-hour drive. I was exhausted. I went straight to the bed in the loft to rest. It was so quiet, like being in a whole different world. I'm used to hearing cars passing and people talking outside my house. But here, nothing. I fell asleep quickly. About 4 hours into my sleep, I suddenly woke up with a start. I looked around and then heard a strange tapping noise. I tried to find where it was coming from but couldn't. It sounded like someone tapping on the window near the back door. I thought maybe I was just imagining things and went back to sleep. Day 2 asterisk, nothing unusual happened and I slept well. Day 3 asterisk, I woke up very early, around 3:30 a.m., to a loud crash coming from the attic ladder, which was right behind the couch I was sleeping on. I didn't move. Then I heard footsteps. You know that creepy feeling when it seems like someone's watching you? That's exactly how I felt. I was lying on my side, staring ahead, refusing to turn around. Suddenly, I felt something, or someone, crawl over me. I could feel their hands on either side of me, and I knew their face was inches from mine. Like I said, I didn't turn to look. They stayed there for what felt like forever before crawling back and then off the couch. I heard my dog let out a soft bark. Then someone shushed her and said, "Good girl." The presence stayed a long time, almost forever. Then I heard footsteps walking toward the back door. Still, I was frozen with fear. I didn't go back to sleep. Later, I checked on my friends once I felt it was safe. None of them had left their rooms that night. I told them what happened, but they just said I was imagining things. I partly agreed, and we continued our day as planned. Later on day 3, after spending the day at the lake with my friends, we returned to the quiet, cozy cabin. The caretakers told us there was a river about a 20-minute walk into the woods. My friends wanted to rest, so I took some bug spray, a small backpack with snacks, and my phone, and headed out alone. The trail was simple. Tall grass lined both sides, and the path was narrow but easy to follow. When I reached the riverbank, I found 2 picnic tables. I didn't want to get eaten alive by mosquitoes, but I had foolishly worn sandals. I put my bag down and started back to the cabin. For some reason, the trail seemed different on the way back, rougher and more overgrown. The tall grass looked disturbed, as if something very large had passed through. At first, I thought maybe a bear since locals warned us about bears around this time. But the size of the damage made me doubt it. I was a little shaken but kept going and made it back safely. Then, curiosity got the better of me and I went back to the river. I sat down at one of the picnic tables and watched the water. After a while, I felt like something was watching me. I looked around, expecting one of my friends to be sneaking up for a prank, but there was no one. I noticed some bushes shaking on the other side of the river. There was a clearing fenced off by 2 logs crossed in an X shape. The longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. I was sure something was hiding behind those thick bushes. I followed the river a bit, hoping to see some wildlife. Nothing. No fish, no frogs, no birds. Just mosquitoes, lots of them. Disappointed, I went back to the picnic table. That's when I heard it. A strange noise I can barely describe. It was like a scream mixed with a gurgle, as if something was yelling underwater. It was not human. I froze. I should have run, but I was stuck in place. Then the bushes behind me rustled. The thing I'd feared earlier was there. The scream came again, louder than before. I finally ran. I sprinted through the forest. What should have been a quick walk back turned into a nightmare. After about 10 minutes, I realized I was lost. I stopped, panicking, trying to find anything familiar. I saw a bridge I had crossed earlier and ran toward it. I kept thinking, why hadn't that thing caught me? Every time I stopped, I could hear it getting closer. I made it back to the cabin and stood on the porch instead of going inside. I faced the forest and cried. I couldn't see anything unusual, but I knew it was still out there. I didn't want to turn my back. I sat there for hours, silently crying, occasionally checking my phone, and now writing this. I don't know what that thing was. The closest thing I can compare it to is a Wendigo. I will never go back to that river again. If anyone can explain what might have been out there, I'd appreciate it. These last couple of days have been too strange to be a coincidence. On the last night, we burned some sage before bed. Around 3:30 a.m., my friend Jake told me he couldn't sleep. We watched some TV when we heard tapping on the back window again. It lasted a few seconds and came in intervals. Jake caught it on video, but we were too scared to watch it. After about 10 minutes, the tapping stopped. Jake and I took turns trying to sleep. Nothing else happened that night. The next morning, loud banging on the shed woke us. We checked but found nothing. I'm leaving in a couple of hours. I can't wait to get back to city life and leave all this weirdness behind. Maybe against my better judgment, I went back to the river to take pictures. Something strange happened. I heard loud gurgling noises mixed with soft music. I was deep in the forest alone. When I returned, I had Jake check the attic while the rest of us waited downstairs. He found nothing. I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse. I did find some sage tucked under the kitchen cabinet, which makes me wonder if someone else knew what was going on. This happened on a road trip late last spring. I was taking a longer way back home after visiting some family, so I was driving around 4 hours each day to reach different spots. This was after the last stop on my list. The final 8 hours back home were just miles of forest and nothing else. I had been thinking about stopping by another town, but it was too far out of the way to make sense. From the place I'd stayed before, I left around 6:30 in the evening to head to the last Airbnb I'd booked. Just a small cottage about 2 hours away. It was along my route back, which was the only reason I picked it. I figured it'd be a better choice than any cheap roadside hotel I might find on the way. The land around there was mostly flat, though there were trees scattered around here and there. When I pulled into the driveway of the place, it was clear someone had planted a row of tall pine trees in a straight line across the front yard. The gravel road split the line of trees right down the center and led to the front of the cabin. The outside of the place, combined with the quiet landscape, gave off a slightly creepy feeling. I parked, found the padlock, and used the code that had been emailed to me to unlock it. Even though the exterior was old and rough-looking, the inside had obviously been redone recently, probably just for short-term rentals. It was small but comfortable. I didn't bring much inside since it was just for one night. I sat at the little table inside and started eating the meal I'd grabbed from a fast food place earlier. Not even 10 minutes later, there was a knock on the front door. It startled me since I hadn't heard a vehicle pull up or any footsteps outside. I stood up and opened the door. A man around his mid-40s stood there with a black and gray beard and a shaved head. He said, smiling, "Hey, just wanted to stop by and make sure you got an okay and everything's all right." Realizing he must have been the host, I told him everything was fine and thanked him. I said goodnight and closed the door. I did think it was a bit strange for him to show up without warning just to ask if I was settled in. Maybe he lived nearby or maybe on another part of the land. One other thing that stuck out was the really strong smell coming off of him. It wasn't horrible, but he smelled like he'd been sweating outside all day. It just seemed a little off. I went back to the table, finished my food, and decided to take a quick shower before bed. I wasn't in there long, maybe 5 minutes, before I started feeling tired and figured I'd just lay down. After drying off, I got into bed and scrolled through my phone for a while. That's when I heard another knock at the door. It scared me just like the first one because, again, I hadn't heard any car or steps outside. It had to be the host again. But why? And why so soon after he'd already been there? Right away, I felt weird about it. I checked my phone but didn't see any message or missed call from him. I walked slowly into the main room, and the knocking continued. I stood there unsure of what to do. Finally, I spoke up and asked through the door what he wanted. He stopped knocking. "I just needed to ask you one more thing. Can you open up real quick?" he said. I didn't reply right away. I had no idea what to say. A few seconds later, he knocked again and asked if I could open the door. I told him it was late and I'd rather be left alone unless it was something important. After that, there was a long pause. The silence made my skin crawl. I waited a full minute, maybe more, and didn't hear him leave. No footsteps, no car, nothing. I started to wonder if he was still out there just standing. I tiptoed up to the door and looked through the little window in it. Nobody was there. Right away, I thought maybe he'd walked off quietly, but I should have heard the gravel crunching under his shoes if he had. So where did he go? I stood frozen for a bit, not sure what to do. The whole thing felt wrong. I didn't move, just stood still, listening. Then I happened to glance toward one of the living room windows. He was there. His eyes were locked onto mine through the glass. I panicked and ran straight to the bedroom, where I grabbed my phone and called 911. While I was on the phone, I heard the sound of the window being pushed up. He was trying to get in. That part made it even stranger. If this guy really was the host, wouldn't he have a key? That's when it all clicked. He wasn't the host at all. When the police got there, the man had already taken off. We had no clue which direction he ran. Later on, we managed to get in touch with the actual host and owner of the property. To this day, I have no idea what that guy's real plan was. Clearly, he had no business being there. I don't even want to think about what might have happened if I had opened the door that second time. I'm just thankful I didn't. Welcome back, everyone, to the channel. Tonight's chilling video brings you 5 supposedly true scary cabin tales. You decide if they're real. Now let's get eerie. Not long ago, I inherited a cabin from my late great-uncle, hidden deep in the forest. It stood as a simple refuge from the chaos of everyday life. Hungry for a break from the city's noise, I packed my things and set off for this remote hideaway. The first few days were calm. The cabin gave me the quiet I had been craving. But on the 4th evening, as the sun sank below the trees, strange things began happening. It started with a faint knocking sound echoing through the walls. At first, I thought it was just rain tapping on the roof, but the sky was clear that night. As the knocking kept going, a feeling of dread crept over me. I walked through the shadowy cabin, searching for where the sound was coming from. It seemed to come from the basement, a part of the cabin I hadn't dared to explore yet. Nervous but curious, I crept down the old wooden stairs into the dark space below. The basement was cold and damp, with an eerie feeling hanging in the air. I flipped on the light, revealing a messy room full of forgotten things from years past. Among the dusty junk, I spotted an old diary lying on a rough wooden table. Curious, I opened it and began to read. The diary was filled with my great-uncle's notes about his time in the cabin. He described strange events, frightening meetings with shadowy figures, and the presence of something unexplainable. The diary hinted at a secret, something hiding inside the cabin's walls, feeding on fear and sadness. With the diary in hand, I dug deeper into the cabin's mystery. The knocking noises didn't stop. They got louder and more frequent each night. Sleep slipped away as I felt trapped in a nightmare while awake. In the dark, I sensed something drawing near, its cold breath brushing my neck. Shadows twisted and flickered on the walls in strange shapes. I woke up soaked in sweat, haunted by vivid dreams that blurred what was real and what was not. Days turned into weeks, and my mind frayed at the edges. I desperately searched for a way out of this horror. Deep inside the diary, I found a passage about an old ritual, a way to break the cycle of fear. It required finding an item full of happy memories and peace. When placed in a special spot inside the cabin, this object was said to keep the evil away and bring calm back to the place. Filled with new hope, I searched the cabin for something meaningful. Among the forgotten items, I found an old silver locket that had belonged to my great-uncle. Holding it reminded me of the times he made me feel safe, and I knew this was the key. Following the diary's directions carefully, I placed the locket on a simple altar in the middle of the cabin. I said the words of the ritual passed down through the family. The air thickened with energy. I braced myself. Suddenly, a bright light filled the cabin, pushing away the darkness that had trapped me. I shielded my eyes from the glow. When the light faded, I was standing in a peaceful cabin bathed in warm sunlight. The evil presence was gone, leaving behind only calm. Now free from the haunting, I feel grateful for the cabin's peace. The knocking has stopped, and my nights are once again filled with restful sleep. Still, as I sit by the warm fireplace, I can't help but wonder about the ancient evil that once lived within these walls. My great-uncle's diary serves as a warning. Darkness can settle in even the most peaceful places. I promise to keep the secret safe, so the cabin remains a refuge for future generations, unaware of the evil that once lurked inside. I needed a place to stay for an unknown amount of time until I could find something more stable. No shelters around here would take me because technically, I still had a home to go back to. Also, I have a cat, and none of the shelters in this area accept pets. I wasn't about to leave my cat behind. About a year ago, I got a job that let me work fully from home. Right away, I asked my aunt if I could move into her weekend cabin. Stays empty most of the year anyway, and I could keep an eye on it. She agreed, and I agreed. At the time, I wasn't seeing anyone, and all my friends were online friends through Discord. I like being alone, and it didn't bother me. There was a moment when I thought I would try going out more, doing things, but then the pandemic hit, so that plan never happened. The cabin isn't even that far off the beaten path. I have a neighbor who lives next door. I could get groceries delivered. Whenever I called the local police, they'd show up in about 20 minutes. I'm not too far from town. If I had a car, I probably would have left already and lived out of it. My aunt even offered to buy me a car, but I stupidly turned it down because I didn't have my driver's license back then. I still don't, honestly. I never really needed one. My aunt drove me to work, and besides that, I barely went outside. The strange things started after about a week. It began with random bouts of forgetfulness. The episodes came and went, but now I wake up almost every night around 4 a.m. having forgotten everything except who I am. The cabin has 3 bedrooms. I sleep in the smallest one. I keep the door open, and there's no curtain on the window, but it doesn't help. The woods are completely dark. There are no street lamps or anything. Once I turn off the lights at night, it's total blackness. The first night I woke up like this, I found myself in complete darkness, like a void. No sights, no sounds, just a faint feeling of sheets underneath me. I didn't remember where I was or even if I was on Earth. Every time it happens, I feel like there's a lamp somewhere in the dark. I manage to find it, turn it on, and then the room comes back to me. That's when I remember I'm in a cabin all alone. I tried leaving the lights on or using the little nightlight my aunt had since I was a kid, but then I couldn't sleep at all. The first time it happened, I stayed up and went into the living room, which shares space with the kitchen. My cats, Luna and Shadow, were sleeping on the back of the old green couch. Luna was white and fluffy, and Shadow was a short-haired black cat. They woke up when I came out. Let me explain the cabin's layout. The front door opens right into the kitchen. The kitchen takes up one half of the big room, and the living room is on the other half. They're separated by a breakfast bar and a door that leads to the backyard. The backyard door is half glass, and it's where I first saw him. The bathroom and bedrooms are off the living room, except the attic bedroom, whose stairs are near the kitchen. That night, I ended up sleeping on the couch and had my first nightmare in the cabin. This is where things got even weirder. Whenever I slept in the living room, I'd dream of a monster I couldn't see. This creature was invincible and immortal, and if it spotted me, I was instantly dead. That's always the nightmare I have when I sleep there. When I tried sleeping in the larger bedroom, I had dreams about starving mutant animals living underground. They hunted humans. Sleeping in the attic bedroom brought nightmares where I wandered around a strange house, eventually finding a giant horror in the attic. Every time I woke up from those dreams, my heart raced so hard I felt like I was on fire. The only room where I didn't get nightmares was the small bedroom, so I settled for the forgetfulness instead. It wasn't as painful as the dreams. I used to let my cats out in the backyard daily. They almost always came back by night, but if they didn't, I'd go searching. Now, I don't let them out anymore. Here's why. Months ago, I was on my lunch break, eating in the small clearing in the backyard. Suddenly, I stopped because I saw a huge dog outside through the back door. I'm not a dog person, so I don't know breeds well, but it looked like the dog from Scooby-Doo. Same size, but all black. He stood on all fours, and his head would have reached my shoulder. I'm 48. He was chasing a small, fluffy brown dog that could fit in a handbag. The little dog wore a collar and was running desperately. The big black dog chased him but didn't seem to be going full force. It looked like he enjoyed watching the small dog panic and run. Neither dog saw me. Luna rubbed against my leg, ready to go out. But I didn't see Shadow anywhere. He was outside with that black dog. Panicked. I couldn't find Luna either, so I locked her in the bathroom just for a bit. I opened the back door, and the little dog's cries got louder. No other sound came. I called for Shadow. Relief flooded me when she quietly snuck inside from the side of the house. I closed the door, locked it, and held her close. She pressed her head affectionately into my trembling hands, then went off to find her food. I stood up and checked the door again. That's when I saw him, black dog, standing still, staring right at me with cold gray eyes. He didn't move. I thought he didn't notice me sneak Shadow inside, but he did, and I'm sure he wanted me to know it. I dropped to the floor, hiding under a pillow so he wouldn't see me. None of the windows had curtains, but I didn't want him watching me. I crawled to the kitchen and checked the front door. It was locked. The front door has a window that looks out on the deck, and there I saw the small body of the brown dog. No blood, no wounds, just a lifeless body. I called animal control and reported the dog. They asked for the address and I gave it. Then they said their department doesn't cover this area. My only option was to call the police. The police arrived at the cabin 20 minutes later and asked about the dog. My aunt has security cameras outside, so I showed them the footage on my laptop while the officers stood in the kitchen. First, I showed the backyard video where the black dog chased the little brown dog. The black dog stayed in the backyard until police showed up. Then we watched the footage of how the brown dog ended up at the front of the house. Another dog appeared in the video. An identical black dog laid the small dog's body down in front of my door. Behind him, in the trees, a third black dog waited for the other to finish. They both ran off together. The female officer took notes quickly, looking almost bored. The older white-haired male officer sighed. He said I was the 100th person to call about these dogs. Pets were disappearing or found dead. They were even investigating a missing child now. They assured me I was being taken seriously, but every time they caught some dogs, more appeared. They had an ongoing investigation, and my report would be part of it. They advised me not to let my pets outside for the time being. The officers left, and I locked all the doors for the first time, deadbolting them. I tried to push it out of my mind. Most nights, I played video games with my internet friends on Discord. I usually joined around midnight. My best friend Sarah messaged me one night, asking if I was okay. She said I seemed off. I told her maybe it was work stress or that a wild dog almost killed my cat earlier. When I told her about the police warning of hundreds of wild dogs in the woods and the missing child, she told me to move out. I told her I couldn't, since my aunt was away for 4 months and I had nowhere else to go. If I didn't live with my parents, I'd stay with her, she said. We joked about it being better than living with parents at 29. We played games together until after 3 a.m. Later, I checked the news. A woman had gone missing, and the child was still not found. A few black dogs had been shot that night. I went to bed in the small bedroom. The cats joined me, tired and cuddly after begging all day to go outside. I set up a litter box again, but they didn't like sharing it. That night, they settled and curled up at the top of my bed, but I found a spot. That night, I dreamed about a pale tan cafe with large windows facing empty streets. There was no coffee smell, no barista, no customers. I was sitting across from Sarah. We'd never met in person, but we video called almost daily. In the dream, she wore comfortable gray clothes, and her long dark hair brushed her arms. She looked paler than usual. She asked if I knew I was dreaming. I said yes, now I did. She warned me that the dogs aren't dogs. They're the monster I dream of but can't see. She said I must not let Luna The reason I'm really into hiking and backpacking is because I love being outdoors, and recently I went on a trek through the Welsh mountains with some friends. We planned to spend the night in a bothy before heading out to climb some peaks the next day. For those who don't know, a bothy is basically a very simple shelter in a remote area. Sometimes an old barn, sometimes a small cabin, just something to keep you dry and out of the wind. They're free to use, usually have a fireplace, a few pieces of basic furniture, and not much else. You don't need to reserve them. You just arrive and use them. Sounds pretty good, right? So we ended up in an old stone cottage built sometime in the early 1800s. It had 2 floors, big enough for all of us to spread out upstairs and get some rest. The night was cold and damp, but we kept the fire going strong to stay warm. It was one of those perfect nights where you're deep in the wilderness, everything's quiet except for the fire crackling, and you're just chatting with your friends. No one else around as far as we could tell. This particular bothy was about a 4-hour walk from the nearest road, so it wasn't exactly a busy spot. Around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. At first, there was no noise or anything. I just had a weird feeling like something wasn't right. I lay there trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, but then I heard it. The front door of the bothy creaked open slowly. After that came the sound of footsteps downstairs, heavy and slow, like someone was walking carefully around the main room. I froze. My mind raced, wondering if it was one of us who got up, or maybe someone else had somehow wandered in. The footsteps kept going for a minute or two, steady and deliberate. Then I heard the door slam shut hard. After that, everything went completely silent, total quiet. By then, everyone was awake and alert. It was just a feeling we all shared. We were miles from anywhere, and it made no sense for someone to walk all that way at 3 a.m. It wasn't like a random traveler passing by, yet it felt like someone was inside with us. We couldn't just ignore it, so we decided to check it out. Quietly, we tiptoed downstairs without saying a word. The tension was thick, but no one wanted to talk about it. The footsteps were loud enough to be worrying, but how they stopped so suddenly and the door slamming made us uneasy. We opened the front door and stepped out into the dark night. There was nothing. No flashlights, no sounds of anyone nearby, not even animals. This place was very remote, far from any roads or paths, so it wasn't like someone just wandered past. We thought maybe there was a camper nearby who set up a tent and might have come over thinking the bothy was a restroom or something. But there was no sign of anyone at all, just the cold air and the wind howling. We stood outside for a while, trying to figure it out, but nothing made sense. No signs of a break-in, no tracks, no distant voices, no footsteps, just silence. After a few minutes, feeling kind of foolish standing out in the cold, we went back inside and locked the door. The whole situation felt strange, but we told ourselves it was probably just the wind or the old house settling. The weirdest part came the next morning when we were packing up. A local told us that this bothy had a reputation for odd happenings. Many people who stayed there said they heard footsteps when no one else was around or had the feeling they were being watched. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. I don't really believe in ghosts or anything like that, but that night felt different. It wasn't just the footsteps or the door shutting. It was how everything went still after, how quiet it was, and how we couldn't find anyone nearby. It's the kind of experience that messes with your head and is hard to explain. I've stayed in plenty of remote places before and never had anything like this happen. I've heard people talk about the energy in certain parts of the Welsh mountains, but I always thought it was just superstition. Now, I'm not so sure. I'm not saying it was definitely something supernatural, but that night was definitely unusual. It's probably just the isolation playing tricks on us, but even now, I get chills remembering it. If you ever stay at a bothy like this, keep your ears open. You might hear something you can't explain. This took place a few years back, and I've debated sharing it. It was during the summer of 2021, mid-July. The world was still stuck in a weird pause, everyone mostly indoors. So my then-girlfriend Emma, my close friend Mike, and his sister Lily all agreed we needed a weekend away in the woods. No phones, no crowds, just trees, hiking, and quiet. Mike's uncle owns a small off-grid cabin in the Pinewood National Forest. Nothing fancy, no electricity or running water. But there was a propane stove, a wood-burning stove, old bunk beds, and an outhouse about 60 feet behind the cabin. It's a 50-minute drive from the closest paved road, and once you're there, you feel totally cut off. Exactly what we wanted. We arrived Friday afternoon. The cabin had that musty, untouched smell. Not gross, just old wood, dust, and forest air. Everything inside was neat, no signs of mice or other animals breaking in, which surprised me. We unpacked, made dinner on the propane stove, and spent most of the evening outside playing cards and looking at the stars. Honestly, it was one of the best nights I've ever had outdoors. We went to bed around 11:30 p.m. Mike and Lily took the bottom bunks, and Emma and I took the top ones. The cabin's just one main room with a tiny kitchen off to the side, so it felt cozy. We locked the front door with an old metal latch that slid across. Not modern security, but it was something. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up. At first, I didn't hear anything, but I felt something, like when your mind drags you out of sleep for no clear reason. Then I heard footsteps, not like animals, no scampering or twigs snapping. These were slow, steady, heavy steps on the porch, like boots on wooden planks. I stayed frozen and listened. At first, I thought maybe Mike was going out to pee, but when I glanced over the edge of the bunk, he was still wrapped in his sleeping bag. Same with Lily. I whispered to Emma, and she was already awake. She asked if I heard it, and I nodded. The footsteps stopped. We didn't hear anything else for a few minutes. Eventually, I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and opened the door. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt. No sounds in the trees. No movement. Just still, silent forest air. I even stepped a few feet out toward the clearing, shining the light all around. Nothing. I went back inside, and we decided maybe we just imagined it or mistook an animal. The next morning was cool and clear, but when we stepped outside, I immediately noticed the old wooden shed behind the cabin, about 30 yards into the woods, was wide open. None of us had gone near it. Mike even joked when we arrived that it looked like a scene from a scary movie. The shed's door was warped and sagging, half covered in moss. Inside, there were some old tools, chopped firewood, rusty nails, and random junk. Nothing dangerous, just weird that the door was open. It looked like someone had moved things. An axe was leaning against the door instead of being in the woodpile, and a coil of rope was clearly unrolled and left lying around. Lily said it even smelled faintly like smoke inside, which none of us had brought. We all felt a little uneasy. We double-checked the door latch, pulled our bags closer, and joked about Mike's uncle's haunted shack. But then around 1:45 a.m., something happened. We all heard the front door creak open. It was slow and long, just like in a movie. But the door was still bolted shut. We checked right away. It hadn't budged. Still, everyone heard it clearly. It was loud enough that Mike sat up immediately, asking if someone was outside. We searched around, but there were no animals, no wind, no movement in the trees. Still, the air felt strange, thick and heavy like before a storm, but with no clouds. We barely slept that night. The next morning, we found a handprint on the outside of one of the back windows. It was faint but sticky looking, like someone touched the glass with bare hands and left a residue. None of us remembered touching that window. Lily swore she hadn't even gone near that side of the cabin. That was enough for us. We packed up and left a day earlier than planned. On the way out, we called Mike's uncle and told him what happened. He laughed it off and said something like, "Oh, you met the cabin ghost." He said other visitors had heard footsteps and door sounds over the years, but that it was harmless. He never mentioned that when we were planning the trip. So yeah, I'm not saying the place is haunted, but something was definitely strange. Could it have been an animal? Maybe, but we've all camped enough to know what raccoons, coyotes, or bears sound like. This felt different, deliberate, like someone was out there watching. We've camped a lot since then, but never in that cabin again. I'm still trying to understand what really happened. I was 10 when this happened. Emily, my older sister, was 13, and Lucy, my little sister, was 7. My dad worked as a freelance software developer. When I was younger, he made pretty good money from his projects, but he was buried in debt over $400,000, and mom wasn't very good at managing money, so we never really had extra cash. That meant vacations were rare, maybe once every few years, and usually we stayed at a relative's place. Dad had just finished a big project for an important client, so we were celebrating by watching a scary movie called Dead End because Dad loved horror movies and enjoyed scaring us girls. We were halfway through the film when the phone rang. Dad went to answer it and came back, pulling Mom along while we kept watching. Lucy paused the movie and grabbed Duchess, our dog, because she was scared. They returned about 10 minutes later and told us we'd be spending the weekend in a cabin. We weren't sure what to think, but the client Dad had been working for owned a nice cabin by a lake in the hills and offered it to us for a very low price. It was Thursday, and Mom suddenly started packing in a hurry, so we missed the rest of the movie that night. After school the next day, we loaded up the family car and drove to the mountains. It took about 2.5 hours, so it was already late when we arrived. We unloaded and started exploring the cabin. It was a ranch-style cabin with a small loft space you could climb into, just about head height, maybe 3 feet tall. It looked like it was meant for storage, but it was a perfect hideout for the 3 of us, filled with board games we played. After picking rooms, Mom and Dad took the biggest bedroom. Emily chose the smaller room with a single bed, so Lucy and I shared the last room with a queen-size bed. The bed had a window on the right side without a curtain and a lamp on the left, which was the only light in the room. Opposite the bed was a locked closet, and we never figured out what was inside. We went to sleep around 11 p.m. Lucy was a kicker in bed, so I slept next to the lamp to prevent it from being knocked over. I must have fallen asleep fast because the next thing I remember was Lucy gripping my arm, trying to burrow under me. She was making scared noises, but I didn't understand at first. I sat up and saw something pale and human-shaped moving away from the window. My sleepy brain took a few seconds to realize what I was seeing. Then I jumped out of bed, pulling Lucy with me. We ran to our parents, who said we were just imagining things. Mom told us to go back to bed and to tell them if we saw anything else. I annoyed myself by agreeing, and we returned to the room. Lucy refused to sleep by the window, so we switched spots. I told her a story to help her relax, and we both soon fell asleep. I didn't wake until morning. The next day, we explored around the lake for about an hour before Dad decided we should visit the nearby town. There were lots of small shops, and our parents went into all of them. We had lunch and dinner there before heading back to the cabin. Near the cabin, Emily joked about something, and we all laughed, but then Dad raised his hand to hush us. He took a step forward and opened the cabin door with just one finger. I thought it was odd that the door wasn't locked, but I didn't realize the meaning right away. Emily shuffled closer to Lucy and me, starting to say something, but Dad shook his head, signaling her to be quiet. He went inside and was gone for a minute or two while we waited on the porch. Mom called his name and he told us we could come in. Inside, we found him standing in the living room. He locked the door behind us and took Mom to the bedroom for a quick talk. Emily, sensing something was wrong, distracted Lucy and me by suggesting another round of the board game we had played the night before. We hadn't played for more than 5 minutes when Mom and Dad returned. Mom started cleaning breakfast dishes and Dad joined our game. We played for hours until Dad told us it was time for bed. It was only 9 p.m., which made Emily angry because she was allowed to stay up later on school nights and even later on weekends. Lucy and I went to bed while they argued. We returned to our usual spots, Lucy by the window and me by the lamp. I read to Lucy for a while before we both fell asleep. Suddenly, Dad burst into our room, scooped Lucy out of bed, and grabbed my hand. He pulled me into the hallway, where I saw Emily being taken by Mom the same way. I heard a high-pitched whining from the living room and saw our dog sitting alert by the back door, looking tense and uneasy. Dad didn't put Lucy down or let go of my hand. They rushed outside to the car. Dad went back inside to grab Duchess, then sped away from the cabin as fast as he could. He drove straight home without saying a word. It took about 30 minutes for Duchess to calm down. Dad told Emily what happened the next day, but Lucy and I didn't find out until years later. He said he woke that night to strange moaning sounds outside his bedroom window. When he looked, he found the front door unlocked. Some things in the kitchen had been moved, and Duchess was growling by the back door, which was also ajar. He locked it up and got us all out safely. When he returned to the cabin to collect our bags, he saw several sets of footprints outside the window of the room Lucy and I had slept in. This all happened in a very remote forested area in northern Norway. This happened about 6 years ago. Back then, I was living with my mom in a small cabin on a farm surrounded by thick woods. Our farmland was part of a bigger piece that had been divided and sold off, so we did have neighbors, but they were about half a kilometer apart. We liked it that way because it gave us privacy. It wasn't like there was no one nearby if I needed help. That thought made me feel safe enough to walk alone at night, usually between 7 and 8 p.m. Sometimes I would go earlier or later, depending on the day. There were even times I wandered out around 1 or 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep and felt restless. Looking back, that was really careless. After what happened, I never walked after 6 p.m. again. I always made sure there was still some daylight when I left. The path I took was a loop along a road. The first half was open, passing by all the other farms, including mine. If something bad happened there, someone probably would have seen it. Plus, phone reception was good, so I could call for help if needed. The second half was different. It was hidden behind about 150 meters of woods between the farms, on a back road that stretched about 2 kilometers behind the farm. It was during that part of the walk that something strange happened. It was late at night. I don't remember the exact time, but it was completely dark except for the beam from my flashlight. I was close to the curve in the path that would bring me back into the open when I heard a voice. It said help over and over in a flat, calm tone. It didn't sound scared at all. I took my earbuds out and paused my music to make sure I wasn't imagining it, but the voice kept repeating, "Help, help." A stupid part of me almost called back because I thought, someone's in trouble, like a naive kid might. I was about 15 or 16 then, but then I realized how dumb that would be and started backing away slowly. The problem was my cat had followed me on the walk and wasn't retreating with me. She was moving toward the voice, quietly hissing. I remember trying desperately to get her to come back without letting whoever it was know I was there, if they hadn't noticed yet. But I was scared and didn't want to stay any longer, so I ran forward and grabbed her. Then I turned around and sprinted back to the house. I don't know if it was smart to turn my back on the voice, especially since I was making a lot of noise running. There was no way they hadn't noticed me. I couldn't tell if they were chasing me, but I was terrified the whole time. In my head, I pictured someone hidden in the dark chasing me. Even though I couldn't hear anyone behind me, I didn't slow down until I was safely inside. But it didn't end there. Even though it was terrifying, part of me still worried about whoever it was. What if they really needed help? So, I asked my mom to drive us back to the spot. Another foolish choice, since when we got there, we found nothing. We called out, but no one answered. We stayed inside the car, luckily, neither of us wanting to be careless. We drove home without seeing a soul or any sign of what had happened. But I was still bothered by it the next morning, so my mom drove me there again. We searched around closely, but there was no sign anyone had been there recently. No body, though I thought that was extreme to look for. But I guess shock can make people strangely quiet, which might explain the voice and why no one replied afterward. That made me worry maybe we'd been too late and might find a body the next day. I'm not sure if I would have preferred that, though, since then I could have put a face to the voice. Instead, we found absolutely nothing. Even now, I have no clue who that voice belonged to or why it kept repeating that calm, emotionless help. My mind has come up with some scary guesses, kidnappers, serial killers, all the usual nightmare ideas. But I guess I'll never really know. A buddy of mine's family owns a cabin on about 75 acres out in northern Oregon. It's deep in the woods, pretty remote, with no neighbors anywhere nearby. The closest paved road is a good 3 miles away. The cabin is hidden and surrounded by forest all around. You'd never find it if you didn't already know the way. They even have a locked metal gate about a mile down the dirt road to keep out strangers and hunters. The place always felt secure. You get the usual animals: black bears, foxes, raccoons. Sometimes you hear owls or a moose crashing through the underbrush, but nothing ever made me feel uneasy being there. A couple of falls ago, my friend and I went up for a weekend, just the two of us. We brought a cooler with food, his old golden retriever, and a couple of rifles just in case. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. The whole plan was to disconnect. We spent the day hiking around the land, shooting at cans, and doing little repairs on the cabin, clearing branches from the trails, chopping firewood, cleaning the stove's chimney, typical fall tasks. That night, we cooked dinner over the fire pit, had a few beers, then went inside. As the temperature dropped, we lit some candles, played music on a Bluetooth speaker, and spent about an hour at the table tying fishing flies. My friend's really into fly fishing, and I've learned a bit, so he brought his vise, feathers, and thread, and we were just sitting there, chatting while working on some patterns. Around midnight, just as we were about to pack up the tools, it happened. 3 loud, forceful bangs on the back door. Bang, bang, bang. We both froze, that kind of freeze where you feel your hair stand on end. Each hit made the door shake in its frame. It wasn't an animal brushing past. It felt like something was trying to get in, slow and purposeful. Suddenly, the Bluetooth speaker cut out. No warning beep, no disconnect noise, just silence. It had been fully charged. My friend's old dog, who had been lying by the stove, got up and stared fixedly at the back door. He didn't bark or growl, just stared. Then everything outside went completely quiet. No wind, no bugs, no distant sounds. Just a heavy silence you can feel more than hear, the kind of silence that makes your stomach twist. After what felt like a full minute, my friend whispered, "Did you lock the back door?" I said yes, but we still grabbed the rifles and flashlight and quietly checked every door and window. Nothing, just trees, darkness, and that awful feeling like something was just beyond the light. At one point, while shining the flashlight across the tree line, we both saw something move. It wasn't a full shape, just a quick motion stepping out of the beam before disappearing. Like it was avoiding the light. Could have been nothing, but maybe it wasn't. We ended up staying in the loft, rifles close, barely saying a word. There were no more sounds, no more bangs, just hours of tense silence. Around 5:30 in the morning, the woods slowly came back to life. A few crickets chirping, distant birds singing. That's when we finally relaxed. In the daylight, we found a deep dent in the metal back door, low down like something about a man's size had hit it hard. The door frame was cracked too, but there were no footprints, no disturbed dirt, nothing. We checked the trail camera aimed at the entrance. It had turned off sometime during the night, but the batteries were fine. We packed up and left pretty fast. We didn't even eat breakfast, just threw everything in the truck and got out of there. I've been back since, but only with a bigger group. I still don't know what that was. My friend's dad replaced the door but kept the dented panel. He said he's seen a few things out there but didn't want to go into details. I live in a rural part of eastern Idaho, right on the outskirts of a small town along a quiet 2-lane highway. The place barely has more than a couple of gas stations, a diner, and a few roadside motels lining the main drag. Once you leave the town center, the paved roads give way to dusty gravel paths that wind their way past scattered houses and private land covered in woods and open fields. It was an ordinary weekday. I work from home, and I usually wrap things up around 5:30 or so. That evening, I decided to head into town to grab a few groceries and pick up some supplies for the house. Even though it's right along a main highway, traffic is always light, and the shops are rarely packed. I pulled into the small market lot and went inside to start shopping. While I was walking through one of the aisles, I noticed a man looking in my direction. First, I brushed it off. I figured we'd just accidentally looked at each other at the same time. I went back to what I was doing, thinking it was nothing. But a few minutes later, in another part of the store, I noticed him again. He came into the same aisle I was in, which was completely empty at the time, and stopped just a few feet away. I kept my eyes forward and focused on the shelves, pretending to browse, but I couldn't help noticing that he wasn't picking anything up or moving around much. I shifted my gaze slightly to the side just to get a better idea of what he was doing, and sure enough, he was staring directly at me. I gave a quick, polite nod and continued on. He didn't respond. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I quickly grabbed the last few things on my list and made my way to the checkout. Once I'd paid and walked out, I went toward my car, which I had parked farther out in the lot, like I usually do. I popped the trunk, loaded up the bags, and got in the driver's seat. Before I pulled out, I looked across the parking lot. There were maybe 25 to 30 vehicles scattered around, but something didn't sit right with me. I spotted him again, standing still between two parked cars, facing toward me. He didn't have a cart or any bags in his hands. It didn't look like he'd bought anything at all. That just confirmed the weird feeling I had. Maybe he was some long-haul driver running on barely any sleep, I told myself. I tried to let it go and left the lot, driving back toward my place. By now, the sky had darkened, and the narrow dirt road leading to my property was dim and empty. I parked in front of the house and carried in the first load of groceries. While putting them away, I got sidetracked on a call from my mom. We talked for a bit, and after hanging up, I went back outside to grab the rest of the bags. That's when I saw something strange. At first, it was hard to see in the dark, and I had to squint and let my eyes adjust. But far off, on the edge of the property where the tall grass meets the gravel, I saw a truck. It wasn't running, and none of its lights were on. I could only make out its outline against the night sky. I own about 35 acres out here, and the area where the vehicle was parked is definitely on my land. I know for a fact that it wasn't there when I got home earlier. And if someone had just pulled over to turn around or take a quick break, why would they park with all the lights off and not move for so long? I walked slowly to my car, grabbed the rest of the groceries, and never took my eyes off the truck. I tried to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was just someone trying to sleep in their vehicle instead of booking a motel. Technically, they were trespassing, but I wasn't looking to stir up anything unless I had to. You never know who could be in there or what they might do if you startled them. I went back inside, dropped off the groceries, and pulled back the curtains at the front windows just to keep an eye on the field. Over the next hour or so, I began to feel a little less uneasy. The truck still hadn't moved, and nothing else seemed out of place. I figured it probably was just some tired traveler trying to save a few bucks. I watched TV for another hour, glancing outside now and then. Eventually, I closed the curtains and went upstairs to get ready for bed. I don't remember much after lying down. I must have dozed off pretty quickly. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. I didn't check the time, but I'd guess it was around 2:30 in the morning. Still half asleep, I got up and crossed the room, stepping into the hallway and opening the bathroom door. That's when I heard a soft creak downstairs. I paused and listened closely. That noise wasn't familiar. I gently opened and closed the bathroom door again to see if it might have been a sound from the floorboards, but it didn't happen a second time. I walked quietly to the end of the hallway and looked down the staircase. The lights were off downstairs, and only a sliver of moonlight lit up part of the kitchen. That's when I noticed it, just the faintest shadow moving along the wall in the downstairs hallway. I wasn't sure if the figure was actually inside the house or standing outside near the back door, casting a shadow through the glass. But my chest tightened. My instincts screamed that something wasn't right. I slowly backed up into my bedroom and closed the door carefully, trying not to make a sound. Once inside, I grabbed my phone and called the sheriff's office. I kept my voice low while I explained what I saw. During the first few minutes of waiting, I didn't hear anything else, and part of me started to wonder if maybe I'd imagined it, until the floor creaked again. This time it was slower, more deliberate, like someone was tiptoeing across the living room. I held my breath and waited. A few moments later, I heard faint movement again, and then the sound of feet hurrying around, like someone trying to get out fast. Right after that, I saw flashing lights through the window as a patrol car pulled up. I heard pounding footsteps downstairs, then the sound of the front door being opened. Apparently, the intruder had run outside the moment the cops showed up. They chased him down and managed to catch him before he could get back to the truck parked in the field. When they brought him back to the house, I saw his face. It was the same guy from the store. He'd followed me, worse than just watching me at the store or hanging around the parking lot. He'd somehow gotten inside my house. He was carrying a weapon, too. He told the officers that he only planned to rob the place, but honestly, it didn't feel that simple. He hadn't taken anything. He didn't even have a bag or anything he could have used to carry stuff. And he knew someone was home. He had to. I'm sure he was watching me from out in the field all night, just waiting for the right moment. Whatever he really meant to do, I'd rather not know. Back when I lived in a quiet part of northern Vermont, my boyfriend at the time took me for a ride in his pickup. He told me he wanted to show me something he had heard about from one of his college teachers. We already lived in a pretty remote area, but we drove even further into what felt like absolute wilderness. We ended up on this stretch of road that was about 5 to 8 miles long, with nothing but thick woods on both sides. No houses, no signs, no driveways, just trees as far as you could see. Then he stopped near a small clearing in the trees where there was a really old, very overgrown driveway blocked off with a rusty chain. An old, falling apart sign hung there that said, "No trespassing." We parked on the side of the road and walked in for about half a mile. At the end, there was this abandoned log cabin that looked really old. I don't know exactly when it was built, but it was old enough that it wasn't hooked up to any electricity. There were no outlets anywhere inside. Felt strange, but my boyfriend said he had been there before. He led me around to the back where there was a door we could break open. He told me that the last person who owned the place had written in their will that no changes could be made to the property after they died. No farming, no remodeling, so that's probably why nobody bought the land since then. I don't remember if we came in through the second floor or climbed some stairs, but once inside I was on this loft area that looked down over the rest of the cabin. There wasn't any railing, just a sheer drop of about 15 feet right at the edge. Maybe there weren't even real stairs inside, just a ladder or something. This was back in the fall of 2012 when I was a sophomore in college, so some of it is a bit hazy. I noticed an old ironwood stove downstairs and a wooden countertop, but otherwise, the cabin was pretty bare and made completely out of wood. There was no sink in the kitchen and no bathroom, so no plumbing either. The loft where we were sitting was covered in thousands of dead flies, like literally all over the floor. It was creepy and gross. I guess they might have gotten trapped in there over the years, but the huge number of flies everywhere and how fresh they looked was really unsettling. For some reason, my boyfriend decided this was a good place to smoke weed. I didn't want to hang around, but he spread out a blanket over the flies and sat down to roll a joint. I took a few puffs, but I started feeling really uneasy, so I stopped. I smoke regularly, but this situation just felt wrong. Then I suddenly noticed the sun was setting fast, and the light was fading quickly. The cabin took on this terrifying feeling, like something bad was coming. I knew I had to get out of there. I told my boyfriend several times that we should leave, getting more and more anxious, but he wasn't worried at all. He took his time, slowly rolling a cigarette and pulling out stuff from his pockets, laying everything on the blanket and putting it away one piece at a time. It made me really angry that he wasn't taking me seriously while I was so desperate to get away. I ended up leaving the cabin first and started running down that half-mile dirt driveway to get back to the road. My boyfriend followed slowly behind, fumbling with his things. We got out of the woods just as the last light was disappearing before full darkness set in. Remember, this country road had no street lamps at all. He had a flashlight, but I didn't feel like having a flashlight meant we were safe. I felt like something was watching us, and whatever it was, it felt really bad. I don't know if I was overreacting or if my boyfriend was just too high to care, but I never really trusted him again after that. I still don't know why I let myself get into that situation. Needless to say, he's not part of my life anymore. There's a moment in life, at least once, when you truly feel fear. And I mean real fear, the kind that makes your chest feel hot and frozen at the same time, like the last breath you took is stuck inside you. Everything slows down, your stomach gets tight, you feel like you're screaming but can't make a sound. Maybe you try to run, or maybe you freeze. Maybe you think you can fight, But for people who felt real fear, it stays deep in your bones, like it changes a part of who you are forever. I want to tell you what happened on December 14th, 2008. Back then, I was just a little girl, only 9 years old. My family was really strict and religious. We were in church every Sunday, sometimes Wednesday too. We read from the Bible often, and there were always talks about heaven, angels, and hell. The idea of burning forever if you were bad was terrifying for a kid that age. That winter, my family flew out to Utah. We had rented a small place up in the mountains, far from town. It was a quiet log cabin, hidden deep in snowy woods. We were high enough in elevation that my dad had to bring a small oxygen tank. That's how far out we were. There weren't any other homes nearby, except one other cabin way off in the trees, maybe 3 or 4 acres away. Even with that, the thick snow and trees made it nearly impossible to see anything clearly. Our first night there was cozy. We lit a fire, roasted some marshmallows, even popped popcorn over the flames. My little sisters and I built a snowman out back. Inside, the cabin was open and had a kind of loft. The top floor had 2 twin beds, and downstairs under the staircase was where my dad slept. There was a tiny television and an old, stained couch that smelled like syrup. I got the bed near the edge of the loft, close to the railing, or where the railing should have been. My sister Maya, who was 5 then, got the bed farther from the drop. Our youngest, Rosie, only 3, stayed with Dad downstairs. I actually slept great that first night, probably the last truly good sleep I've had since. I'm 24 now. It started early the next morning. A soft noise woke me. It wasn't loud, more like a faint scratching. It wasn't sharp like nails on glass or light like a pen tapping. It was rough, uneven, like something heavy dragging pointed nails across the wood floor slowly. At first, I thought it was Dad walking around. Then I figured maybe it was a bear outside. We were in the mountains, after all. But as I lay still, listening, I knew something was wrong. The noise had a rhythm, a deliberate pace. I had a habit of sleeping with a pillow over my head, so I felt hidden. But curiosity got the best of me. I peeked through the small space between the bed frame and pillow, looking toward the edge of the loft. That's when I saw it, just barely there. Something dark, like a shadow, on the loft's edge. It looked like a hand, not a normal hand. The shape was wrong. There were fingers, yes, but they were long, too long, and bent strangely like they had extra knuckles. They drummed on the edge of the wood. I froze. My body tensed up so tight I couldn't even swallow. I shut my eyes and turned my head away. No, I told myself it wasn't real, that I was dreaming, that I was just a scared kid. It would be morning soon. Dad always woke us up around 6:30 with his loud singing. This couldn't be real. I kept whispering Bible verses under my breath, the ones I'd memorized at Sunday school. I repeated them again and again. Maybe it would protect me. Maybe it would go away. After what felt like forever, though it was probably just a few minutes, the air around me shifted. The tension eased. I got brave and opened one eye, just barely. The thing was gone. Whatever it had been, it was no longer there. I didn't hear it leave, but it was gone. I rolled over to face the wall. There was a small old table next to my bed with an antique oil lamp on it. But behind the table, tucked just out of view, I noticed a faint outline, like a square, a small wooden panel, a hidden door. At the time, I hadn't seen the movie Coraline yet, but if I had, that little door would have reminded me of it right away. It was small and old and dark brown, like it had been burned or soaked in dirty water. I eventually fell back asleep. Later, when the sun was up, I told Dad about it. My sisters and I waited downstairs while he checked it out. Then he called us up to see it. It wasn't a door exactly, more like a tiny crawl space, probably for storing supplies. Inside were some fire logs and a few jugs of water. Nothing creepy. Even Rosie climbed in, and Dad took a photo of her inside. That night, that's when the real nightmare began. I was already nervous about sleeping, so I asked Dad to leave a light on. He wasn't thrilled about that idea, so he just made a fire instead and closed the chain screen over the fireplace. Then we all went to bed. The fire burned warmly for a while. I watched the shadows from the flames flicker and dance on the high wooden ceiling. Couldn't sleep. Eventually, the fire burned low. The orange glow faded. I turned over to face the wall and that little door. The tapping started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the loft or the floor. It was coming from behind that small wooden door. I stayed perfectly still. Maybe it was a branch outside, scraping the cabin just right. Maybe I was imagining it. But then it stopped. I opened my eyes just a crack, peeking from under my blankets. That's when I saw it again. The same fingers, long and crooked, slid through the narrow gap between the door and the frame. They moved like something melting into the room. Then the whole door began to shake, scratching noises loud enough to make Maya shift in her bed. At least I hoped that movement was her. Then it was silent. For a moment, I told myself it was over, but the quiet didn't help. The fire went completely out. The last bits of orange faded, and the cabin went dark. Then, bang, the little door slammed hard from the inside. I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. My chest tightened until I was taking short, painful breaths. Another slam, then another. Boom, boom. With each hit, my fear grew worse. My legs and arms locked up. My eyes were shut tight, but I could feel something on my bed. Boom. Mira, cut it out. Maya's voice finally broke the silence. I almost cried. She was awake. She heard it too. Then I heard her bed creak. Mira, did you? She didn't finish her sentence. What followed was a scream, sharp and loud. I didn't move, because I knew whatever Maya saw, it wasn't me. Something was at the foot of my bed, sitting there. The tears poured out of me, even though I wouldn't open my eyes. I didn't want to see that door again. I didn't want to see it. Bang. The door shook again, like it was being hit with both fists. The wood bent inward. Bang, bang, bang. I kept whispering Bible verses through my tears, shaky and quiet. I begged for help, begged God to stop it. The bed creaked again. I could feel the covers shift. Something moved closer. Then footsteps on the stairs. Fast, heavy. What's going on up here? That. I couldn't breathe from relief, but I kept praying. I was shaking now. My whole body had given up staying still. I felt it. Something next to me, right at my side. Its claws caught on the thick quilt and tugged at the fabric a few times. Bang. Then a sound. Pop. A click. I didn't know what it was. And then I saw it. Deep-set eyes, black and hollow, sitting in a pale face with no color. Too white, too smooth. Its mouth was cut open wide, too wide, like the skin had been slashed up toward the eyes. I saw teeth, sharp ones, smelled awful, like rotting meat. Behind its head, I noticed something hanging, some kind of shredded coat or fabric, decayed and falling apart. But the eyes looked once human, now ruined. The irises looked like fire through smoke, yellow and red, glowing, cat-like, but not slit. It leaned toward me, then stopped. In a blur, it pulled away. I heard it land, maybe on the floor. I didn't know. Couldn't move, couldn't scream, and just like that, it was gone. When I was around 14 years old, my cousin's family and mine were staying at our summer cabin. The cabin sat on a small rise, and down at the bottom of this rise was another cabin with a wooden footbridge and 2 small boats. The whole place was surrounded by thick woods, so when you looked out the window, all you really saw was the hill sloping down to the lake and the boats tied up there. It was about 8:30 in the evening when my dad, my younger sister, my 3 cousins and their dad, and I decided to go down by the lake to light a fire. My grandparents, aunt, and mom chose to stay behind since it was getting late. We just wanted to sit and look at the lake, watch the stars, and talk a bit. We brought along my grandparents' dog and my cousin's dog too. We walked down to the water, started the fire, and talked quietly for about an hour. Then the conversation died down, but it was a calm kind of silence. Suddenly, I got this uneasy feeling, like someone was watching us from the woods behind us. We were sitting with our backs turned to the trees near the cabin. The feeling was strange, but I tried to distract myself with other thoughts. Out of nowhere, my dad said, "Yeah, I'm fine." Everyone looked at him, puzzled because no one had asked a question. Dad glanced back toward the cabin, then at my cousin sitting beside him, and said again, "I'm doing okay." She looked confused and asked, "What do you mean?" Dad answered, "You asked me how I was, so I told you." She said, "I didn't ask you anything." Dad looked puzzled, then explained that he had felt someone lean close and whisper in his ear, "Hey, how are you?" He said he felt warm breath on his neck and a hand rest lightly on his shoulder. At first, he thought it was my mom, so he turned around but didn't see anyone. Right after he told us this, the two dogs we had with us started growling loudly, staring toward the woods behind Dad. We all got scared, quickly put out the fire, and ran back up to the cabin. Since that night, we have never stayed outside the cabin after dark. It's a memory I'll always carry with me, but whatever it was seemed polite enough to check on my dad, so I don't think it meant us any harm. If anyone has any idea what this could have been, please tell me. The only thing I can think of is a Swedish forest spirit called Vitra that likes to play tricks on people. Some say they can burn down houses or trap people if annoyed, but they're not really known for being kind, so I'm not sure. This happened to me and my family during a summer getaway. We were on a trip in northern Wales. We own a large cabin there where we spend part of every summer. It's close enough to a hotel that we can walk over and use all of its amenities. One of the things we did daily was head to the hotel pool. It was on our fourth day of swimming that things started to feel strange. There was a man in the pool who looked out of place. He was wearing goggles and kept diving beneath the water over and over again. He looked like he was maybe in his late 20s. Just to paint the picture, my family at the time included me, my 15-year-old sister Tia, our younger sister Lily, who was 9, our aunt, and both of our parents. This man began swimming underneath us and getting too close for comfort. My mom quietly signaled for us to stay away from him, but that didn't stop him. He turned and started heading toward us again. That's when we all decided it was best to get out of the pool. I headed into the changing room by myself, and my stomach dropped when I saw him come in right behind me. My dad had already left, so I quickly changed and rushed out of there without saying anything. When we all met outside the hotel, my little sister said she needed the toilet. As she started heading toward it, we spotted the same man from the pool loitering near the entrance to the women's restroom. My mom immediately accompanied her, feeling uneasy about the situation. Later, my mom told us that while they were in the bathroom, a woman who looked around 40 came in right after them. She stood inside one of the stalls with the door open and just stared at my mom without saying a word for what felt like 10 seconds. Then she slowly closed the stall door. It was creepy and made everyone uncomfortable. We left the hotel and started the short walk back to our cabin. That's when we noticed the same woman walking behind us, not too far away. She wasn't rushing, just staying within sight. Eventually, we took a different path than she did, but all the paths looped back around to the same area. When we got back to our cabin, we spotted her again from the window. She was wandering between cabins with no clear destination. But then, she suddenly turned and started walking toward ours. We kept watching. Instead of coming up to the door, she moved behind the cabin next to us and then disappeared into the woods behind it. Those woods are thick and quiet. No one ever goes back there. We've been coming here for years, and I've never once seen anyone enter that forest. I'm fairly sure it's off-limits or private land. That night, we were watching TV when my older sister said she heard a loud knock at her window. Her room faced the back, toward the woods. She was shaken, so I followed her in and pulled the curtains aside. It was pitch black outside, and I couldn't make out anything except the outline of the trees. We all went outside with flashlights. After a few minutes, my aunt said she could see 2 different sets of footprints in the soft dirt, leading away from the cabin and into the trees. Before bed, my dad and I decided to go out and check one last time just to be safe. To our surprise, we saw other people in nearby cabins also peeking out their curtains and looking around outside. Something strange was definitely going on. Out of nowhere, we heard a helicopter flying very low over the cabins. It was a police chopper, clearly searching for someone. My dad and I didn't waste any time. We got back inside and locked everything. We even placed a glass jar on top of the front doorknob so that if anyone tried to come in, it would fall and make a loud noise. The next day was our last one there. We were getting packed when the cleaner arrived. She seemed on edge and told us something terrible had happened at the cabin right next to ours. She said there had been a break-in the night before, but it wasn't just a burglary. The people staying in that cabin had been found inside, stabbed to death. Brutally. The cleaner told us it seemed like a man and a woman had been watching guests at the cabins for a while, deciding who to target. If they were just after valuables, why did they kill those people? To this day, my family and I still wonder about that strange man in the pool and the woman who stared at my mom. Were they working together? Were they the ones who followed us from the hotel and slipped into the forest? I honestly don't know, but no matter how grim it sounds, I can't help but feel grateful that it wasn't our cabin they picked that night. One of my friends, Emily, asked me to come with her to a party. It was being hosted by her old friend Rachel. Emily and Rachel had gone to a private Christian school together during their younger years, from elementary through middle school. But once they got to high school, Emily switched to a public school where she met me, while Rachel stayed on the private school path. They kind of drifted apart and started hanging out with different crowds. That's probably why Emily brought me along. It was Rachel's birthday, and apparently her parents had rented a cabin for the occasion. They had done the same thing the year before, but they didn't know that Rachel had secretly turned it into a party back then too. That party was a success, so she was planning to do the same thing again this time. Emily and I drove up to the cabin together. It was way out there, pretty far from anything. Aside from the thick woods behind it, there wasn't much else around. We couldn't even see any neighboring cabins, though I guess they were probably empty anyway since it was the middle of winter. At first, I was a bit uneasy. I wasn't gonna know anyone there, and I wasn't sure how that would go. But I figured after a couple drinks I'd loosen up. And honestly, the whole party in the woods idea was so familiar. It felt like the start of one of those cheesy, scary movies. Emily and I even joked about how it sounded like the opening scene of a horror flick. As if that wasn't enough, it was a party full of girls who had all gone to Christian school. The setup just felt like a warning sign. We got to the cabin, and it was pitch black outside. We had to use our phones to light the way just to find the door. Inside, everything looked fine. Rachel seemed happy, and there were quite a few people already there. But something felt a little off. It was like the party was split in two. Emily and I had no clue what was really going on. I recognized this one guy there. He had the name of our town tattooed in messy letters across his neck. Emily and I had tried not to laugh about it, but we were also a little concerned. We wondered if it meant he was part of some gang or something. Anyway, I don't remember exactly how it started, but the main group at the party wanted a few people to leave. I think it was because that group had been drinking a lot, even though they hadn't brought any of their own booze. To get them to go, someone said that a ranger or an official was coming by soon, and that there were only supposed to be a couple cars parked by the cabin and a small group inside. There was talk that one of the guys might be on probation and couldn't risk getting caught doing anything illegal. Whatever the reason, the plan worked. The group, about 4 or 5 guys and one girl, started to leave. But just as they walked out, the girl came back in a moment later. She walked in loudly saying, "I just want to wish the birthday girl a happy birthday." Her voice was way too loud and it felt weird, like she was trying to get everyone's attention on purpose. People turned and stared at her, confused. Not even 2 seconds later, we heard a loud crash, a window shattering in one of the back rooms. Then it kept going. More windows breaking, yelling. People started panicking and screaming. I was just sitting there trying to make sense of it. Emily and I had only been there for about 15 minutes when it all fell apart. The girl who had invited that group suddenly said that she was pretty sure at least one of them had a gun. I don't know if I was in shock or just couldn't wrap my head around it, but I just sat there thinking, so this is really happening. Most of us stayed inside the cabin. A few went out to check if the group was still around. After some time passed and things seemed quiet again, people started to leave. Even though there was still a real fear that those guys might be waiting in the woods, most people just wanted to get out of there. I remember 3 girls who had planned to spend the night. They grabbed their things, arms full, and headed for the door. But right after they stepped out, we heard someone scream from the trees. All three girls turned around and rushed right back inside. Looking back, it was almost funny. One of the girls actually started crying, but it turned out the scream was just from another girl who had just gotten to the party. She saw her friend outside and yelled in excitement. Emily and I stayed at the cabin a while longer. We didn't want to leave Rachel all by herself. Most people had already gone home by then. Aside from us, only a small handful of people were left, and luckily they were planning on staying the night. Around 2 in the morning, Emily and I finally left. We had talked about whether we should call the police, but since there had been underage drinking, nobody really wanted to get the authorities involved. Rachel was also nervous that her parents would find out about the party. She had decided she'd just make up a story about how the windows got broken. Thankfully, that group, the ones we thought might be gang members, never came back. Even though the night was terrifying, what stuck with me most was just how surreal it all was. Party in a cabin, in the woods, thrown by a bunch of Christian schoolgirls. It was the summer right after my first year of high school when my family decided to take a trip to Glacier National Park. We rented a small, weathered cabin tucked into the forest just beyond the park boundary. I clearly remember feeling excited about spending a whole week surrounded by trees and fresh air instead of roads and buildings. Since I loved reading, I planned to spend most of my days curled up on the front porch of the cabin with a book in my hands. The afternoon we got there, the sun was still high above, casting scattered shadows across the dusty driveway. My parents and my little sister Katie got out of our SUV while I pulled our bags from the trunk. The cabin owner, an older man named Harold, came limping over to say hello. After some quick greetings, Harold took us into the 2-bedroom cabin. It was cozy and a bit old-fashioned, with wooden walls, mismatched quilts, and a stone fireplace in the center of the main room. The smell inside reminded me of my great-uncle's attic, kind of damp and dusty. Harold walked us through the place, pointing out the small kitchen, the bathroom, and the 2 bedrooms. "Well, that should cover everything," he said, rubbing his dry hands together. "If you folks need anything, just call out. I live a little over a mile down the road." We thanked him, and my dad handed him a check for our stay. Harold took it, shuffled to the door, then paused before leaving. He looked back at us with a strange glint in his pale eyes. "One more thing," he said in a hushed tone. "I'd suggest staying in after dark. These woods get odd at night, if you know what I mean." My dad let out a nervous laugh. "We're city folks, Harold. I think we'll be okay." Harold gave a slow nod, his eyes scanning each of us. "Sure you will. Just make sure to lock the doors and close the curtains when the sun's gone. Best to stay indoors. Trust me." With that, he turned and left, his warning hanging heavy in the air. "What a character," my mom said with an uneasy chuckle. Katie looked worried. Her big brown eyes darted toward the window. "I bet he was just having fun trying to scare us," my dad said, though he didn't sound too sure himself. "Let's unpack and make a plan for the week." We got busy putting our clothes and groceries into the wooden drawers and cupboards. Soon, the strange meeting with Harold faded from my thoughts, and I started daydreaming about all the reading I'd get done in the porch swing. As the sky turned orange, we cooked some hot dogs and beans over the fire pit outside. I flew through pages of The Divide by Elizabeth K. Coyotes howled in the distance as we joked and talked, the flames snapping and cracking. Stuffed and happy, I said goodnight and went to the room I was sharing with Katie. She was already in bed, curled up under the quilt on the twin closest to the door. I changed into my sleep clothes and turned off the small lamp between our beds. Moonlight came through the curtains, making shadows that danced slowly across the floor in the night breeze. Somewhere deep in the trees, I heard an owl hoot. It was answered a moment later by the cry of a distant coyote. I rolled to my side and closed my eyes, almost asleep, when a strange sound split the air. It was a long, drawn-out moan, somewhere between a howl and a wail. That didn't sound quite natural. I opened my eyes, suddenly wide awake. The strange call came again, louder and closer. It was coming from somewhere in the woods nearby. Sitting up, I glanced toward Katie's bed. She was still there, seemingly asleep. I then looked at the window behind me. The curtains were still partly open. I thought about getting up to close them, but something made me stay still. That strange howling continued, every few minutes, never the same twice. Each time I heard it, something cold tightened inside my chest. I didn't dare look out the window. I was terrified something might be looking back at me. At some point, I realized Katie's bed was empty. I had no memory of her getting up. Had I dozed off and missed it? My heart started to race. I looked at her bed, sheets rumpled, covers pushed aside. I slowly turned my head toward the middle of the room. My breath caught. Katie was standing in front of the window, motionless, staring through the opening in the curtains. I could only see her outline in the pale moonlight, but it was enough. She wasn't moving at all. Her arms hung at her sides. "Katie," I whispered. My voice barely broke the air. She didn't flinch. I said her name again, louder. "Katie." Still, she didn't react. Her eyes stayed fixed on something outside, through the gap in the curtain. I wanted to reach for her, but I couldn't move. The howling rose again, closer, sharper, vibrating in my chest. Finally, I forced myself out of bed. The cold wood floor stung my bare feet. I took a slow step. "Katie, are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. No reply. I crept closer. In the moonlight, I could see her face. Her eyes were wide open but glassy, like she wasn't really there. I looked where she was staring, but all I saw were dark trees shifting in the breeze. Another terrible wail echoed through the woods. I jumped, every hair on my arms standing straight up. Fighting the instinct to run, I reached for her hand. "You're scaring me," I whispered. "Come back to bed." Before I could touch her, Katie's head jerked toward me. I stumbled backward, heart thudding. For a second, it looked like she recognized me. But then she turned back to the window like she hadn't seen me at all. I didn't want to be near that window. I didn't want to be near whatever had a hold on my sister. "Let's go," I said, more to myself than her. I reached for her again and grabbed her cold hand. She didn't resist. Slowly, we walked back to the beds. The awful sounds outside started to fade. Soon all I could hear were the usual nighttime sounds. Bugs and birds, maybe an owl in the distance. I helped Katie get under her covers and looked into her face. Her eyes were still blank, no spark of recognition. It was like part of her was still by that window. "Just go to sleep," I told her, tucking the quilt around her shoulders. She didn't answer, just kept staring up at the ceiling. I felt exhausted but knew I wouldn't be able to rest. Moving quietly, I shut the curtains all the way, cutting off the moonlight. The room became completely dark. I climbed back into my bed, pulling the covers up tight. For a long time, I just lay there listening, but the night stayed silent. Eventually, sleep came, uneasy and full of strange dreams. I woke up suddenly, just as the first gray light of morning began to fill the room. Everything was quiet. I listened for the wailing, but there was nothing, just birds outside the cabin. I sat up and looked at Katie's bed. She was asleep, breathing steadily under her blankets. The vacant stare from last night was gone. I wondered if she remembered any of it. As I got dressed, I thought about telling our parents. But what would I say? Would they believe me? Maybe I should wait and see how Katie acted. If she seemed off, I'd speak up. But if she was normal, maybe it was best to keep quiet. I sat in the living room, watching the early sun light up the clearing outside. Everything looked peaceful. It was hard to believe the things I'd heard and seen just a few hours ago. I hoped that whatever happened last night was a one-time thing, and that the rest of our vacation would be calm. Katie came out of the bedroom, her hair messy from sleep. I watched her walk toward the bathroom. "What?" she mumbled, yawning. I shook my head. "Nothing. Did you sleep okay?" She shrugged and disappeared behind the bathroom door. At breakfast, I kept an eye on her. She looked the same as always, grumpy, quiet, tired. No trace of that haunting look. I figured I'd keep the whole thing to myself unless she brought it up. After breakfast, Katie slouched on the couch to watch cartoons while my parents talked about possible trails to hike. I mumbled something about going for a walk and slipped outside with a book, one of Darcy Coates's creepy novels. Couldn't remember which one. The sunlight warmed the ground, and birds chirped from every direction. I followed a narrow path away from the cabin. Pine needles and twigs crunched underfoot. The forest looked normal now, peaceful, like nothing had happened. Maybe it had all been a weird dream, but I couldn't shake the image of Katie's blank expression. Lost in thought, I didn't realize how far I'd gone until I stepped out of the trees and found myself on a deserted dirt road. It stretched off in both directions. Looking back, I saw nothing but woods. I'd wandered far. Still, something made me go a little farther. Around a bend, I spotted a weathered fence. A tilted sign nailed to a post read, "No trespassing private land." I stood there, looking between the slats. There seemed to be It was late November in northern Utah, and I was around 8 years old. My dad came up with the idea of taking all of us to a cabin for the weekend. My mom thought it would be a great way for the four of us, me, my sister, my mom, and my dad, to spend time together, so we went along with it. We booked a small cabin for a few nights and even skipped school on Friday to get a head start on the trip, which I didn't mind at all. When we got there, the air was freezing. It made sense since December was just around the corner. We got everything unpacked and figured out where each of us would sleep. After dinner, we all got ready for bed and started thinking about what we'd do the next day. Since we arrived kind of late, there wasn't much time to do anything that evening. That first night, I started hearing sounds outside. It reminded me of someone walking around. I checked the window but couldn't see anything. I assumed it was probably just some animal and tried to go back to sleep. But after about 15 minutes, I heard it again. I woke up my sister, who was around 12 at the time, and she heard it too. We both walked over to the window and spotted something outside. We couldn't quite make out what it was. We figured it would be better if whoever or whatever it was didn't notice us, so we backed away from the window and got into bed. Neither of us slept well that night. The next morning, my mom was inside cooking breakfast and my dad was already outside. I asked her if I could go out and join him, and she said yes. My sister stayed inside with my mom while I stepped out. Outside, my dad was talking to some guy. He was a short, slightly heavy man with a shaved head wearing a military cap. He looked super anxious for some reason and was sweating a lot even though it was freezing. I walked up to them and my dad looked over and said, "This is my boy," and told him my name. The guy looked at me and smiled. "Nice to meet you, kid. I'm Tom," he said. He just kept smiling. I smiled back and greeted him. I know it probably wasn't polite, but I was just a kid. I asked him why he looked so nervous. He kind of coughed and said something like, "Oh, I'm okay. Just still dealing with some memories from the service," while pointing to his hat. He seemed normal enough at first. My dad really seemed to like him too. Tom said that he had rented another cabin nearby with his family and just thought he'd come by and say hello. My dad invited him in for breakfast, and everything seemed fine. After breakfast, I went out to play with my dad and Tom. While playing, I tripped and scraped my knee. It really hurt and I started crying. My dad was inside right then because my mom had been calling for him. That left me out there alone with Tom. He rushed over and told me to come to his cabin. He said he had bandages. I agreed and followed him. We chatted on the way. I told him about video games I liked. But then he started asking strange things like how old I was and what shoe size I wore. I didn't know my shoe size, but I told him how old I was. He laughed a little and said, "Good to know." Also, his cabin wasn't close at all. It was at least a 20-minute walk through the woods. By the time we got close, I was worn out and figured it wasn't worth the trip anymore, but I didn't want to turn back either. I'd already walked too far. When we got to the cabin, he asked me to go in first, so I did. Right away, I noticed something was off. There was nobody else there, no family. I asked him where his family was, but he didn't answer. Instead, he acted like he didn't hear me. Then he locked the door behind us. That's when I started to get really uneasy. He said, "I'll go grab the bandage, kiddo," and disappeared into the kitchen. He came back with one and told me to sit down while he put it on. As he did, he held my leg with one hand and rubbed up and down. He said something like, "You're a pretty strong kid. I like that." I got really uncomfortable and stood up fast. He asked what was wrong, and I just told him my leg felt better and I should go back before my parents started to worry. He tried to talk me into staying a bit longer, even offered to feed me. I really didn't want to stay, but I was alone, and I wasn't sure how to get back through the woods. Plus, the door was locked, so I agreed to eat quickly and leave right after. While we sat there, he asked how much I weighed. I guessed about 75 pounds. He nodded and smiled again, saying, "Perfect weight." I asked him what he meant, but he just kept smiling. Creeped me out even more. When I said I wanted to go, he said, "No way. Things are just getting started. You don't want to miss the fun." The way he said it made my stomach turn. Then we heard a loud noise come from the bedroom. He got up, looking annoyed, and went into the room. I heard him yelling, "Did I say you could move? Stay put. I've got company," or something like that. Then he walked back out smiling and slowly shut the door. "Sorry," he said. "That's just my wife. She's really sick and not supposed to be around guests." He was still smiling. I glanced around and saw clothes scattered everywhere. The place was a mess. It seemed like he'd been living there for a long time. A few minutes later, a woman stepped out from the bedroom and said, "I'm hungry." She looked very pale and had red rings around her eyes like she'd been crying. Her voice was weak. He snapped at her, yelling, "Get back in there." She looked at me, then went back into the room. I asked where his kids were and he ignored me. Then he said he had some kids' clothes he wanted me to try on. That's when I knew I had to get out of there. I started crying. He hugged me and whispered, "It's okay. Nothing bad will happen. Just try on the clothes." He walked into the back room and that was my chance. I went to the door, unlocked it, and quietly stepped outside. I didn't care if I got lost. I just couldn't stay there any longer. As I hurried away through the trees, I could still hear him shouting from inside. Where the hell did he go? I knew I shouldn't have left him alone. "You probably let him leave." He yelled at the woman again, calling her names. That's when I froze. I heard footsteps not far from me. I hid behind a tree and looked in his direction. He was outside, scanning the woods, clearly trying to find me. He stepped out a little and yelled, "Hey, it's okay. You can come back. No clothes. I've got toys in the cabin. Just come back." I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I just kept going in a straight line, hoping to reach someone. Anyone. I think I heard him yelling again behind me, but I didn't stop to listen. I just ran. After what felt like forever, maybe an hour, I finally saw a cabin through the trees. It was ours. My dad was outside, looking around for me. I ran straight to him, crying, and told him everything. I said Tom wasn't a good man, and how weird he acted, and how he touched my leg and said odd stuff. My dad instantly called the person we rented the place from. He told me to never go off with strangers again. We left that day and asked for our money back. The owner of the rental cabins apologized and called the police. They went to Tom's cabin and checked it out. Nobody was there, not even the woman, but they said his clothes and stuff were still inside. After that, not much happened. The police asked some questions but never called us again. We never heard anything more. Tom probably wasn't even his real name. I don't think he was a vet either. I still wonder what happened to him, and who that woman was. How did he get a wife? Why was he living out there? He looked like he'd been there a while. I guess he took off because he figured the cops would be on their way. So many questions I'll never get answers to. I was 10 when this happened. My older sister, Lila, was 13, and my little sister, Nora, was 7. Back then, our dad worked from home as a contract software developer. He had some high-paying gigs, but because he owed a lot of money, at least $500,000, and because our mom struggled with handling finances, we rarely had any extra money lying around. That meant we only went on trips once every few years, usually to visit extended family. Dad had just wrapped up a big job for a major client, and we were marking the moment by watching a scary movie. * Final Destination star. He had a weird love for horror movies and liked spooking the three of us. Partway through the movie, the landline rang. He got up to answer it, then came back and took Mom into the other room. Nora paused the film and grabbed our dog, Pepper, holding her tight because she was nervous. After about 10 minutes, they returned and told us we were going to spend the weekend in a cabin. We didn't really know what to think, but apparently the client dad had just owned a lakeside cabin in the hills and offered to let us stay there for the weekend at a big discount. It was Thursday, and Mom started packing like crazy, so we never got to finish the movie that night. After school the next day, we loaded the van and hit the road. The drive took a little more than 2 hours, so it was already dark by the time we arrived. We brought our bags inside and started looking around. It was a single-story cabin with a little loft area built into a corner wall that you could climb up into. It was only about 3 feet tall and probably meant for storing stuff, but it was perfect for us to sit in and play games. We found a bunch of board games up there and started playing. We picked out bedrooms. Mom and Dad got the master room. Lila chose the smaller one with a twin bed. That left me and Nora with the last room, which had a queen bed we could both sleep in. On the right side of the bed was a window with no curtain, and on the left side was a small nightstand with a lamp. That was the only light in the room. Across from the bed was a closet with a lock on it. We tried opening it, but it wouldn't budge. I never found out what was inside. We went to sleep around 11. Nora sometimes kicks in her sleep, so I slept closer to the lamp in case she knocked it over. I remember lying down, and the next thing I knew, she was grabbing onto my arm and trying to hide beneath me. She was whispering something fast and scared, but I couldn't make sense of it. I sat up and looked at her, then turned toward the window and saw something pale, shaped like a person, moving away from the glass. I was still half asleep, so it took a moment to register. Then I jumped out of bed, pulled Nora up with me, and ran for our parents' room. We tried to explain, but they brushed it off, saying we must have imagined it. Mom told us to go back to bed and to let them know if anything else happened. I was frustrated with myself later for agreeing and going back with Nora. We switched sides because she refused to sleep by the window. I told her a made-up story to calm her down, and then we both fell asleep. Next morning, we went walking around the lake for about an hour before Dad decided we'd spend the day in the nearest town. There were lots of little stores, and Mom and Dad stopped in just about everyone. We had lunch and dinner in town and finally drove back to the cabin. As we pulled up, Lila made some joke that got everyone laughing, until Dad suddenly raised his hand to make us all stop. He walked up to the cabin and gently pushed the front door open with one finger. I thought it was strange that it wasn't latched, but I didn't think too hard about it. Lila stepped in close to us and tried to whisper something, but Dad gave her a subtle shake of the head, signaling her to keep quiet. He walked inside alone and disappeared for a minute or two while the rest of us waited on the porch. Mom eventually called out to him, and he replied saying it was okay to come in. We went inside and saw him standing in the middle of the living room with a serious expression. He locked the door behind us and took Mom into the bedroom. Lila, realizing something was off, suggested playing one of the games from the loft to distract me and Nora. We hadn't even played for 10 minutes before Mom and Dad came back out. Mom went into the kitchen to clean up the breakfast dishes, and Dad sat down with us to play. We played for a few hours, but then Dad said it was time for bed, even though it was only 9 o'clock. That annoyed Lila. She was usually allowed to stay up until after 10:30, especially on weekends. Nora and I went off to bed while Lila argued about it. We returned to the same sleeping arrangement, Nora by the window, me by the lamp. I read to her for a bit before we both fell asleep again. Then I woke up to Dad bursting into the room. He scooped Nora up with one arm and grabbed my hand with the other. He pulled me into the hallway where I saw Mom doing the same thing with Lila. There was a strange, high-pitched whine coming from the living room, and I noticed Pepper sitting near the back door, fur standing on end, her body stiff and alert. Dad didn't put Nora down or let go of me. We all hurried outside and got into the van. He rushed back inside, came out with the dog, and then floored it down the dirt road. He didn't speak a word the entire drive back. It took about 30 minutes for Pepper to finally relax. The next day, he explained what had happened to Lila, but Nora and I didn't find out until much later. That night, Dad had woken up to what sounded like someone crying softly near the window in their room. He got up to look and found that the front door was unlocked. Kitchen chairs had been moved around. Pepper started growling at the back door, which was cracked open. He quickly locked it, grabbed us all, and got out of there. He returned to the cabin the following day to get our bags. That's when he found multiple sets of footprints outside our bedroom window. A few years ago, my friend Hannah This really happened. Every single time I tell it, everyone in the room ends up staring, frozen. So back in the summer of 2021, my buddies Sam and Lila and I planned a mountain getaway. We had serious cabin fever after all the lockdowns and just needed to get out. We picked a rugged state known for its peaks and laid out a plan to hike and camp in several spots. For one of the nights, we thought it'd be a blast to rent a little cabin deep in the woods. Sam's folks had once rented a lookout tower and loved it. We couldn't get the same tower, but we found a nearby cabin next to one. It was cheap, clean, and tucked away in the hills. Seemed perfect for a night where we could laugh loud, not worry about neighbors, and just let go. We booked it. In the weeks before the trip, we tossed around the idea of dropping acid when we got there. Lila brought an entire tab sheet, folded neatly in a pouch in her backpack, ready for the night. I remember the weird knot in my stomach as we backed out of the driveway and headed off. Something just felt off, this dull pressure in my chest that wouldn't leave. I told Sam and Lila I didn't think we should take anything that night. Lila was furious and we had a big blow-up argument, but I held firm. I just knew that it wasn't the right night. Eventually, everyone cooled off, and we got back on the road. The cabin sat about 35 minutes outside a small mountain town, perched at the top of a winding hill. We held our breath driving the cracked, twisting road up to it. There weren't any pullouts or nearby campsites, just one long, narrow stretch cutting up the slope until it reached the top, where the cabin stood beside the fire tower. We settled in and lit a fire to warm up. As dusk slipped into night, we heard the clear sound of an engine down the road. Headlights flickered through the trees, and a utility ATV pulled up with 3 teenagers inside. They smiled, gave a wave, climbed the fire tower, and left soon after. We had read that sometimes folks came up to visit the tower, so we weren't too surprised. They were the only people we saw. Later, we put out the fire and headed inside. We half-cooked a few hot dogs until they were barely warm and scarfed them down. Then we just sat. Silence. If you've never been in the middle of nowhere at night, you don't know how quiet the world can get. You can hear everything. The tiniest branch snapping, the wind moving through leaves like a whisper. You grow up so used to the background buzz of city life. The distant horns, a fridge humming, traffic murmuring. Out there, your own breathing becomes the loudest sound. We jumped at every little creak or crunch. It got too tense. I popped open a few wine coolers and handed them around. Then I dropped an old board game on the little table between our beds. It didn't take long for us to lighten up. We started laughing and enjoying ourselves. We were more sober than we expected, but just tipsy enough to pretend we weren't hearing noises outside. Later we talk about how we did hear things. Twigs breaking, a low rumbling, maybe an engine far off. But in the moment, none of us wanted to break the calm. We ignored it. Then it happened. A hand. A real human hand slapped the window between us. 3 times, clear as day. We screamed, each of us at the same time. Sam snatched up his phone and hit 911, then put it on speaker and handed it to me. He picked up the iron fire pokers and passed them out like weapons. Lila grabbed her phone and started calling family, choking out quick goodbyes. I just froze, listening. Whoever it was heard us scream. They knew we had called for help. Suddenly, everything was quiet again, like they were trying to sneak away unnoticed. The sheriff's unit showed up maybe 20 minutes later, which was incredible for a call placed that late. They brought dogs to sweep the woods. Nothing. One of the officers said maybe it was a bear, but we all knew they didn't really think that. Their faces said everything. We'd barely warmed those hot dogs. And besides, what kind of bear smacks a window like a person? If it had been after food, why didn't it go for the table with the pans? Why would a bear leave when we screamed instead of charging? It didn't make sense. But they did have one thing to say. On their way up, they passed a car parked at the foot of the mountain. That was the only sign of any human out there. My stomach dropped. Sam and Lila were still rattled, but I couldn't stop thinking about that car. There was nothing else out there. No other roads, no trailheads, no campgrounds. That road led to one thing, our cabin. When we went outside to leave, another terrible thing hit us. Lila's car, which was coated in dust from the rough road, was covered in handprints. All over, in spots none of us had touched. Some were smeared, some were fresh. We lost it, grabbed our gear, barely packed, just tossed everything inside. The officers led us back down the hill. I welcomed every bump in the road that put distance between us and that place. I didn't sleep, couldn't. All I kept picturing was that lone vehicle parked in the shadows below. Remember, there was only one way up or down. Whoever came to the window had parked far down the road, hiked up without being seen, and waited. They didn't want to be noticed. They wanted quiet. They wanted to catch us off guard. It wasn't a random scare. Whoever it was had planned it. I'll never know what they wanted. Maybe it was some sick joke. Maybe it was supposed to go further than that. I'm just grateful Sam thought fast and called for help. Maybe the person didn't know we'd have cell reception that far up. We didn't either. It was a lucky surprise. But I'll never forget that hand on the window, and I'll never go back to that mountain. My friend Zoe owns a small place by a lake in Oregon, and one summer she invited me and her cousin Marcus to stay for a few days. It had already been a fun couple of days, and on the last evening, just like we'd done the previous nights, we headed down to the water to fish. The lake was only about a 5-minute walk from her place. It was around 7 in the evening, which was the perfect time for fishing. To get to the water, you had to pass through a short stretch of woods. There was a clear path in the middle that during the day was usually full of women pushing strollers and kids heading to another beach nearby. The spot we liked was more hidden, and there wasn't a direct path to it. The slope down was steep and slick, and climbing back up later meant using your hands and feet to pull yourself up. We stayed down there until around 8:30, just sitting quietly in the dark, unwinding. We were pretty well behaved and mostly just sat on a log talking. It was one of those moments where you suddenly realize it's gotten completely dark without noticing. I told Zoe and Marcus that we should probably start heading back. They agreed, and we packed up everything. This was the latest we had ever stayed at the lake, and thanks to my wild imagination that loved scary movies, I was feeling kind of nervous. We walked up the slope calmly and for some reason didn't say much. I mentioned how creepy it felt at night, and Marcus decided to make things worse by telling us a story about some old mountain men from back in the 1970s. According to him, they lived in the woods as part of some bizarre group and had supposedly harmed people as part of it. He claimed a few might still be out there. Inside, I was panicking, but I acted like I didn't care and told him to quit trying to scare us. As we reached the path, Marcus looked off to the right and suddenly froze. He looked afraid. Zoe told him to knock it off, and she and I started to climb up the steepest part, the part where you had to use all 4 limbs. Marcus suddenly grabbed both our arms hard and pointed to where he was staring. At first, I couldn't make anything out and just wanted to keep going. But then my eyes adjusted, and I saw a large figure, definitely a man by the outline, slowly moving toward us. I don't know what he planned to do, but being kids, we completely freaked out and scrambled up the hill as fast as we could. At one point we turned around, and the guy was still coming, stumbling quickly now while we climbed. He got pretty close before we finally got up and dashed across the road back to the cabin. At first it might sound harmless, but something about him gave us all a terrible gut feeling. He didn't seem like he was out there for any good reason. We threw our fishing stuff onto the porch and ran to the front door. Of course, it was locked. Zoe's family had a secret knock to show that the person at the door was someone they trusted. It was kind of tricky to get right. Both Zoe and Marcus started banging the knock rhythm as fast as they could. I remember glancing around, checking if that man had followed us, but I didn't see anyone. We got let in, and in a panic, we told the adults everything. They brushed it off and said it was probably just someone we spooked or made uncomfortable. We disagreed, but still felt better being inside with the grown-ups and locked doors. The cabin had a walkout lower level, basically a finished bottom floor, not a creepy basement. It had a door and a couple windows. That's where Zoe and I slept in bunk beds. We went down to change into pajamas, and after about 5 minutes of calming down, we heard the family knock. I thought maybe Marcus was trying to come in from the stairwell door, so I called out, "Come in," but there was no answer. Then it happened again. That's when we realized the knock was coming from the window outside. Zoe and I both froze. Our faces went pale, and that horrible sinking feeling hit our stomachs. It happened again, louder this time. We ran to the stairwell door and bolted upstairs to the living room where Zoe's family and Marcus were sitting. We were crying, trying to explain what we had just heard. Marcus went downstairs to listen and said it was definitely the same knock. Zoe's uncle, older brother, and a cousin all grabbed flashlights and went to check things out. Then we heard the knock again, this time on the front door. Everyone turned and looked at the door. We all stood together, unsure what to do. The knocking happened once or twice more before Zoe's uncle picked up the phone and called the cops. He told them, "I don't know what they want, but someone is trying to get into my house." The knocking continued for another 2 minutes or so and then just stopped. About 5 minutes after that, we heard loud banging followed by police officers calling through the door. Zoe's uncle looked out and saw other officers outside looking around the area. A policeman came in and asked us three what had happened earlier in the woods, and we explained it all. They never found anyone, but those knocking sounds still haunt me. One of the officers said it was probably just some messed up person trying to scare kids. But the part that still makes my skin crawl is how that person knew the exact pattern of Zoe's family knock. We all ended up sleeping on the floor in the same room that night. I never imagined that a simple trip to a cabin in the woods would turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. It was the autumn of 2017 when I decided to get away from everything. I was 29 years old, working a demanding job in marketing, living in a small apartment in Minneapolis. The city had become suffocating. The noise, the people, the endless rush. I just needed silence, space, a place where I could be alone and think. So, I booked a small cabin far from civilization in northern Minnesota near the edge of the Boundary Waters canoe area. The cabin was off the grid, with no electricity, no internet, and no phone signal. I thought that kind of isolation would be perfect for me. I wanted to disconnect entirely. The drive up was long but peaceful. I left early in the morning and made my way through endless pine forests and winding roads, with the air growing colder and crisper as I went north. The leaves were turning colors, deep reds, burnt oranges, golden yellows, painting the woods like a masterpiece. It felt like the kind of place that time forgot. I reached the cabin just before sunset. It was a small, wooden structure, made from rough logs with a steep roof and a stone chimney. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and a stack of firewood sat neatly beside the door. A narrow dirt path led up to the cabin through the trees, and beyond the cabin, the forest stretched out, thick and dense. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. There was a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table, a few chairs, and a bed in the corner covered with a thick quilt. The windows were small, but I could see the trees swaying outside. The smell of pine and earth filled the air. I unpacked my things quickly, lit a fire in the stove, and prepared a simple dinner of canned beans and bread. The first night was peaceful. The quiet was complete except for the crackling fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in the warmth of the quilt. Felt good to be alone, away from the chaos. The next morning, I woke early, the light filtering softly through the window. I brewed coffee on the stove and sat by the window, watching the mist rise over the trees. I planned to spend the day hiking, exploring the woods, and gathering firewood. The forest was beautiful, and I walked along a small trail behind the cabin, admiring the quiet power of the place. The trees were tall and old, their leaves rustling gently in the wind. I spotted a few squirrels and birds, but no other people. As the sun rose higher, the woods became warmer, and I wandered deeper, losing track of time. I wasn't worried. I knew the area well enough from maps and had marked my route on my GPS device. Still, there was a feeling of solitude that crept in, the kind of silence that can make you feel like the whole world has disappeared. By mid-afternoon, I returned to the cabin with a bundle of firewood and some wild mushrooms I had picked. I prepared a small meal and settled down by the fire. The second night, the wind picked up. I heard branches scratching against the windows, and an eerie whistle floated through the trees. It was nothing unusual for the woods, but I felt a flicker of unease. I made sure the doors and windows were locked tight and kept the fire burning all night. The third day passed in a similar way. I spent most of the daylight hours outside, collecting more firewood and filling a small water container from a nearby creek. The creek's water was cold and clear, perfect for drinking after boiling it on the stove. But as the evening came, something shifted. I was sitting by the fire when I noticed faint footprints around the cabin. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth near the back door. They looked like the prints of heavy boots, the kind hunters or workers would wear. I hadn't heard or seen anyone, and I was sure the cabin was supposed to be empty. My heart started to race, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe some animal had left them, but the size and shape were unmistakable. I checked the windows and doors again. Everything was secure. I sat closer to the fire, clutching a long metal poker as a makeshift weapon. The wind howled outside, carrying strange sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but no footsteps. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed up late that night, listening carefully. Around midnight, I heard a soft thud against the cabin wall, like someone trying to be quiet but making a mistake. I froze, gripping the poker, staring into the darkness outside the window. The sound came again, a low scraping noise, as if something was dragged slowly along the wood. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door just enough to shine the beam into the night. The light caught nothing but empty forest. The cold air hit me hard, and I shut the door quickly. My mind was racing. Was it a person? A hunter? Someone lost? Or someone worse? I didn't sleep much that night, jumping at every noise. The next day, I thought about leaving, but the storm was coming. The weather forecast predicted heavy rain and strong winds for the next 2 days. I decided to stay put at least until it passed. That morning, I went to the creek again to fill my water container, but I noticed something new. The ground nearby was disturbed, and I found scraps of torn fabric caught on the bushes. Dark, rough cloth like a jacket. Panic set in. Someone had been near the cabin, possibly lingering in the woods around me. I walked back quickly, scanning the trees for movement. The forest was quiet again, but I didn't trust it anymore. Back inside, I tried to keep busy, cleaning, organizing supplies, stacking wood. But the feeling of being watched never left. That afternoon, the storm rolled in early. The wind shook the cabin, rain battered the roof, and the temperature dropped sharply. The sound of the storm was loud enough to drown out any outside noise, but it also trapped me inside. By evening, the power was out in the nearby ranger station, and my phone still had no signal. I settled by the fire, trying to calm my nerves. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed against the front door, sharp and forceful. My heart skipped a beat. No one was supposed to be out in this weather. I didn't know whether to open it or ignore it. The knocking came again, more urgent this time. I gripped the poker tightly and moved to the door slowly. Peeking through the small window, I saw nothing but rain and darkness. I hesitated, then decided to keep the door locked. The knocking stopped. Minutes passed. Then a faint sound, footsteps crunching on wet leaves and twigs, moving away from the cabin. I stayed awake all night, listening as the storm raged. The next morning, the forest was quiet and soaked. The storm had passed. I went outside cautiously. Near the cabin, I found a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. In the middle was a shallow hole dug into the earth, barely large enough to hold a small animal. Next to it was a piece of fabric, the same dark cloth from before. I felt sick. Someone had been here, digging. Why? What for? That day, I spent hours searching the perimeter of the cabin, looking for signs of whoever had been there. I found broken branches, disturbed bushes, and footprints leading deeper into the woods. Fear gnawed at me, but I refused to panic. I reminded myself that people sometimes hike alone, or hunters might pass through. Still, I decided to pack up some supplies just in case. The next night, I kept the fire going strong and stayed alert. Around midnight, I heard the sound of someone walking just outside the clearing. The steps were slow, deliberate, careful not to make noise. My heart pounded. I shined the flashlight into the dark. A figure stood in the trees about 30 feet away, a man in a dark jacket and hood. He didn't move or speak, just stared. I froze. He took a slow step forward. I backed away, holding the poker ready. Suddenly, he turned and disappeared into the forest. I stayed up until dawn, too scared to sleep. At first light, I packed what I could carry. I planned to leave immediately. As I prepared to go, I noticed my car's tires were flat, slashed. Panic turned to desperation. Someone had been waiting, watching, trying to trap me. With no phone, no way to call for help, and the weather starting to drop even more, I felt trapped. I looked around the cabin, searching for tools or anything that could help. I found an old pump for inflating tires in the trunk, but it was broken. I decided to walk to the nearest ranger station, which I knew was about 5 miles away down a gravel road. I grabbed my backpack with water, food, a knife, and a flashlight. The walk was hard. The ground was muddy and uneven. Every noise in the forest made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, but saw nothing. About halfway there, I noticed footprints again, heavy, large boots, following roughly my path. I sped up. I didn't look back again until I reached the ranger station. The station was closed for the season, but the front door was unlocked. Inside, I found a working phone. I didn't expect much when I decided to spend a week alone at the cabin. It was the fall of 1998, and I was 27 years old. My name is Daniel. I had been working in the city for a few years, stuck in a desk job that drained my energy and left me restless. I wanted a break, a real escape. The cabin was in the northern woods of Minnesota, near a small town called Brainerd. It was a simple wooden cabin my uncle owned, deep in the pines, far enough away from the main road to feel like a different world. I drove there on a Friday morning, my car packed with basic supplies: food, water, some books, a fishing rod, and a small stove. The trip from Minneapolis took about 3 hours, winding through forest roads, the air crisp and dry. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows that made everything look quiet and still. The cabin was small, made from rough logs that had weathered many winters. The roof sagged a little, and the windows had thin curtains that fluttered faintly with the breeze. A thin chimney rose on one side, but I didn't expect to need the fireplace much since the weather was still mild. There was no electricity, no running water, just a well outside and a small outhouse down the hill. The only sounds were the wind in the branches and the occasional bird call. I felt a strange kind of peace there, a welcome change from the noise and rush of city life. I unpacked my gear carefully, making sure to arrange everything in order. I opened the windows wide, letting the fresh air flow in. The inside smelled of pine and old wood, with a faint hint of smoke from previous visitors. I spent the afternoon cleaning a little, lighting a small fire in the stove, and fixing myself a simple meal from canned beans and bread. At first, everything was perfect. The silence was deep but not frightening. It was the kind of silence that allowed you to hear your own heartbeat. I sat outside on a fallen log, watching the sun sink lower and the sky turn orange and purple. The forest seemed endless, stretching in every direction. I made notes in my journal, something I hadn't done in a long time, trying to capture the feeling of being alone in nature. But as night fell, I started noticing little things. Small sounds that seemed out of place. A twig snapping far off in the dark. The rustle of leaves close to the cabin walls. It wasn't animals, at least not the usual forest creatures. I had seen deer and squirrels during the day, but the night brought different noises, more deliberate and heavier. Sometimes I heard footsteps in the distance, slow and measured, but I convinced myself it was just the wind or maybe a fox. Sleep was uneasy. The thin mattress creaked, and the wooden floor made every movement loud. I had brought a small flashlight and kept it near my bed. Around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly to a low, dragging noise outside the cabin. It was soft, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped after a moment, replaced by silence. I told myself it was nothing and eventually fell back asleep. The next day, I found some broken branches near the cabin's edge. They looked like they had been stepped on or maybe grabbed roughly. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I noticed deep footprints around the back of the cabin. They were large, wider than mine, and oddly shaped, almost like boots with heavy soles, but not exactly. I studied them carefully. They didn't match any animals I knew. The prints circled the cabin, sometimes close to the walls, as if someone had been inspecting it. I felt uneasy but still thought maybe it was other campers or hunters passing through. The area was known for fishing and hiking, after all, but no one was supposed to be here this late in the season. I tried calling the small town on my cell phone, but there was no signal. The nearest house was at least a mile away, and the road was a dead end. The next night, the noises came again. This time, heavier footsteps, closer to the cabin. I stayed awake most of the night, watching through the window with my flashlight in hand. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow moving just beyond the tree line. It wasn't a deer or any normal animal. It was too large, too upright. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't dare open the door or make a sound. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to remember that I was in a safe place. The nights after that became worse. The noises changed from footsteps to something more unsettling. Slow scraping, like claws or metal being dragged across wood or stone. The air felt heavier, colder. I started locking the cabin door and even wedging a chair under the doorknob. My meals became quick and simple. I kept my knife near my bed and my flashlight ready. One morning, I found the door to the outhouse wide open. It had been closed the night before. I wasn't sure if I left it open or if someone had been there. There was no clear sign of anyone, no footprints leading away. It felt like someone was playing with me, testing my nerves. I decided to explore a little further that day, hoping to clear my head. I took my fishing rod and walked down to the lake a few miles away. The lake was calm, reflecting the gray sky. I spent hours sitting on the shore, staring at the water, trying to relax. The forest around me was thick, filled with tall pines and patches of fallen leaves. I didn't see any signs of people or animals other than a few birds. When I returned to the cabin near dusk, I noticed something that froze me. My car's back window was smashed, cracked in a spiderweb pattern. I hadn't heard anything while I was gone, but the damage was clear. I checked inside, nothing was stolen, but the mess was unmistakable. I felt exposed, vulnerable. That night, I barely slept. I stayed awake, listening to every noise, gripping the knife tightly. Around 1 a.m., I heard a loud bang on the cabin door. I froze, heart in my throat. The banging came again, slow but firm. Whoever it was, they wanted in. I pressed my body against the wall, clutching the knife, waiting for the noise to stop. It eventually did, leaving only silence. I realized I had to leave. Staying any longer was dangerous. I packed my things quickly the next morning, careful to check every corner of the cabin before I left. I locked the door and slid the heavy chair under the handle one last time. The drive back felt endless, every shadow outside the car windows making me glance nervously. When I reached town, I called the sheriff. They said there had been reports of break-ins in the area, people stealing from cabins and sometimes worse. I told them about the footsteps and noises. They said they would send a patrol out to check the cabin. I never went back. In the months after, I had trouble sleeping. The silence and stillness of the woods were replaced by the memory of being watched, hunted. The real terror wasn't ghosts or monsters, but the knowledge that someone had been close, stalking me, waiting. I kept my locks tight and my windows closed, but the feeling never left. Eventually, I found a new job, moved to a different city, and buried the experience deep inside. The cabin in the pines stayed a dark memory, a place where nature's beauty masked something far more dangerous. The presence of someone else, real and very human, who could make the quiet woods into a nightmare. I never thought a weekend getaway could turn into something that would haunt me for years, but it did. I still remember every moment of that trip to Pine Ridge, a remote forest area in northern Michigan. I was 27 years old, working a tiring office job in Chicago, and desperately needed a break. My plan was simple: spend 3 days alone in a small cabin I rented, disconnect from everything, and just be quiet. The cabin was about a 5-hour drive north of the city, located deep in the woods, with only a narrow dirt road leading to it. The area was called Pine Ridge because of the endless pine trees that covered the hills. I had never been there before. The cabin was owned by a small rental company, and the details were straightforward. No electricity, no cell service, a small wood stove for heat, and a well for water. The website had photos of a cozy, old wooden cabin, with a porch, some basic furniture, and a dirt path leading into the forest. It seemed perfect for what I wanted. I left Friday morning just after sunrise. The drive was peaceful. The highway led to smaller country roads, and as I got closer, the houses disappeared, replaced by tall pines and patches of open land. The air grew cooler and fresher. I stopped once at a small gas station in a town called Millbrook to fill up and grab some snacks, then continued on the dirt road that would take me the last few miles to the cabin. When I arrived, the sun was already dropping low behind the trees. The cabin sat at the end of the road on a little clearing surrounded by thick forest. The place looked just like the pictures: weathered wood siding, moss growing on the roof edges, a small stone chimney, and a porch with 2 old rocking chairs. The windows were dusty, but I could see inside enough to know it was empty and ready. I opened the door with a rusty old key the rental company had mailed me in advance. The air inside was cold and smelled of old wood and dampness. I had brought some firewood, canned food, a small propane camping stove, a lantern, and water bottles. My plan was to keep things simple and quiet. The first night was uneventful. I started a fire in the wood stove, cooked a simple dinner, and settled down on the creaky couch with a book. Outside, the forest was dark and silent except for the occasional sound of wind in the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. I slept deeply, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. Saturday morning, I woke early to a pale light coming through the thin curtains. I made coffee on the propane stove and sat on the porch watching the forest slowly brighten. Pine trees stretched for miles, their branches thick and green. The air smelled sharp and fresh. No sounds from other people, just nature. Felt good. I had brought some hiking boots and planned to explore the area, so after breakfast, I walked down a faint trail leading from the back of the cabin into the woods. The trail was narrow and uneven, winding through dense pine trees and thick underbrush. It was quiet except for the sound of my boots crunching on dry needles and twigs. As I walked deeper, I noticed small signs of wildlife. Tracks in the dirt, a few scattered feathers, a broken branch where something had passed. The air was cool and moist under the tree cover. After about an hour, I reached a small clearing with a rocky stream. The water was clear and cold. I knelt to drink some, feeling refreshed. I looked around but saw no one else. On the way back, the sunlight shifted through the trees, casting long shadows. It was a peaceful walk, almost hypnotic. When I returned to the cabin, I felt calm and ready to relax. The afternoon passed slowly. I read more, chopped some wood to keep the stove going, and started writing in my journal about the trip. The silence was welcome, and the loneliness didn't bother me yet. But then, something started to feel off. It began subtly. Around late afternoon, I noticed small noises outside the cabin. A twig snapping here, a soft rustle there. At first, I thought it was just animals moving in the forest. Pine Ridge was full of deer, raccoons, maybe a fox or two. But the sounds felt too deliberate, almost like footsteps, and they came from different directions. Sometimes it was very close to the cabin, sometimes farther away, then suddenly silent. I checked the windows more than once, peering out into the gathering dusk, but all I could see were trees and shadows. No animals, no signs of people. The sky turned orange and pink, then darkened quickly. That night, I made sure the fire in the stove was strong. I locked the door and closed the curtains. The wind blew harder, making the old wood creak. I heard the snapping twigs again, this time on the porch. I sat very still, listening, heart pounding. I told myself it was just an animal or the wind. I didn't want to imagine someone was out there. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I tried to fall asleep, but found it difficult. Every little noise outside made me tense. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, heavy steps, circling the cabin. They didn't stop for a long time. My mind raced, picturing someone watching me, waiting. The next morning, I decided to hike a different trail to clear my head. I packed some food and water and left the cabin at first light. The trail led steeply uphill, twisting through the dense forest. I was alone, miles from the nearest road or person. As I climbed, the forest grew darker. The trees stood close, their branches intertwining overhead. I passed an old, rusted metal sign partially hidden by moss. It was bent and unreadable. The trail ended near a large rock outcrop overlooking a valley. The view was stunning. Green hills stretching as far as I could see under a gray sky. I sat on the rock, eating my sandwich, feeling a strange mix of awe and unease. The silence was heavy. No birds, no wind, no movement. The forest below looked empty. On the way down, the sun slipped behind clouds, casting long shadows. The trail felt narrower and more tangled. Suddenly, I heard a distant shout, sharp and clear. My heart stopped. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like a man yelling. I froze, listening. No answer. The forest swallowed the sound. I debated whether to return to the cabin or find help. I decided to head back but tried to stay alert. When I reached the cabin late afternoon, I saw fresh footprints in the dirt near the porch. They looked recent and human. I didn't know whose they were, but they hadn't been there before I left. Inside, I checked every window and door. All were locked, but the feeling of being watched grew heavier. That evening, I barely ate. The footsteps returned, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin again. At one point, I saw a shadow move past a window. I held my breath and watched for minutes. Nothing appeared. I tried to keep calm, telling myself I would leave first thing in the morning. But the night brought worse sounds. I heard low voices outside, too faint to understand, mixed with the crackling of dry leaves. My fire was nearly out, and the cabin grew cold. Couldn't sleep at all. Hours passed in darkness, every sound magnified. At one point, I heard someone trying the door handle. It rattled but didn't open. I sat by the stove with a hatchet in my hand, ready for anything. At dawn, the noises stopped. The forest was quiet again. Without hesitation, I packed up my things, made sure to leave the cabin in order, and locked the door behind me. The drive back was tense. Every shadow on the road made me nervous. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. When I reached a gas station a few towns down, I stopped and called the rental company from the payphone. I told them I would not be coming back, and I wanted my deposit refunded. They sounded surprised but agreed. Back in Chicago, I tried to put the experience behind me, but I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, the voices, the footsteps circling the cabin. Months later, I found a local newspaper article online about Pine Ridge. Told a story I wish I never read. The cabin I stayed in was close to the site of a criminal investigation. Years before, a group of men used the area for illegal activities. Drugs, intimidation, sometimes violence against trespassers or locals. The footprints and voices I heard likely belonged to people who still used the forest to hide from the law or others. I never saw anyone clearly, but the fear I felt was real. I don't know why they didn't break in or try to hurt me. Maybe they wanted to scare me away. Since then, I've never gone camping or stayed in a remote cabin alone again. The peace I sought was replaced by a fear that never fully left me. I never thought I would willingly go somewhere so isolated, but after the year I'd had, I needed to get away from everything. My name is Luke, I'm 33 years old, and I live in a small town in Western Oregon. The year was 2018. Work had been relentless, and I was dealing with some personal things that left me feeling drained. I decided to rent a small cabin deep in the woods for a week, hoping that the quiet and solitude would help me clear my mind. I didn't want a fancy place, just somewhere away from people, phones, and the noise of everyday life. I found the cabin online, advertised as a cozy place tucked away in the Umpqua National Forest. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin surrounded by tall pines, a porch with a swing, and a fire pit just outside. The rental was cheap, which made me suspicious at first, but I figured that if it was too bad, I could always leave early. The owner assured me it had all the basics: a wood stove for heat, a small kitchen, running water, and a working outhouse nearby. I packed a backpack with enough food for a week, a first aid kit, some clothes, a couple of books, a flashlight, a good knife, and my phone, though I didn't expect much signal out there. I left town early on a Monday morning and drove up a winding mountain road, watching the trees get taller and thicker the further I went. The air smelled fresh and crisp, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a little peace. The road to the cabin was a narrow dirt track that twisted through the forest. My car bounced and rattled over roots and loose rocks, and at one point I had to back up to let a truck pass. I reached the cabin just before noon. It looked exactly like the pictures. The wood was dark and weathered, and moss covered the roof. There was a stack of firewood beside the porch and a metal bucket near the door. No neighbors were in sight. I pulled out my backpack and took a deep breath. The silence was overwhelming. No cars, no planes, no voices. Just the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like old pine and dust. The floor creaked under my feet, and the windows were grimy but let in enough light. The inside was small. A single room with a wood stove against one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a small kitchenette, and a fold-out bed pushed into the corner. I set down my bag and unpacked slowly. I stacked some firewood into the stove and got it going. The warmth spread through the room and settled my nerves a bit. After eating a simple lunch of canned soup and crackers, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, with tall trees spaced close together. The ground was covered in pine needles and dry leaves, and here and there I spotted patches of moss and small wildflowers. I found a trail that led downhill, marked only by some faded orange ribbons tied to tree branches. It looked like it hadn't been used much recently. I walked about a mile down the trail before turning back. The deeper I went, the quieter it got, like the forest was swallowing sound. I couldn't see any wildlife except for a few squirrels and some birds that quickly flew away when I got close. The sky was gray and overcast, making the woods feel even more still and somber. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire and read a book I had brought with me. I tried not to think about the city or work or anything that might distract me. But as the fire died down, I started hearing noises outside. At first, it was just the wind pushing through the trees. Then, I thought I heard something heavier, like footsteps, crunching on the dry leaves around the cabin. I checked the windows and saw nothing but darkness. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a raccoon, looking for food. The cabin was so isolated, I wasn't worried. Still, I made sure to lock the door and shut the windows tight. I set the flashlight on the table and double-checked that the knife was close by. I lay down on the bed, but sleep didn't come easy. The noises outside kept me awake. The occasional snap of a twig, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. I kept listening, trying to convince myself everything was normal. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. The next morning, I woke early to the sun shining through the window. I felt better after a solid night's sleep. I started a fire, made coffee, and planned to hike a little further today. I wanted to see a small lake the owner had mentioned in the brochure. It was about 3 miles from the cabin, through thick forest and over a ridge. I packed some water and snacks and set off. The trail was rougher than the day before, steeper and rockier. The trees grew so close together in places that I had to push branches aside as I went. The air smelled damp, and the ground was soft from recent rain. I heard birds calling to each other, but the deeper I went, the fewer signs of animals I saw. About halfway to the lake, I stepped on something soft and cold. I looked down and saw a patch of dark, wet soil, like mud. Then, just a few feet away, I noticed a set of footprints. They looked fresh. The prints were large, about the size of a man's boot, and they led in the direction I was going. I stopped and stared. I was sure I was alone here. Whoever had made those prints must have come through recently. I debated whether to turn back, but I told myself it was probably another hiker or maybe a forest worker. The trail was quiet except for the sounds of my boots on the ground. I pressed on carefully. When I reached the lake, it was smaller than I expected, hidden in a clearing surrounded by trees. The water was clear but cold, and I could see fish swimming near the shore. I sat on a fallen log and rested, drinking some water and eating a granola bar. The peace of the place felt good. For a moment, I let myself relax. On the way back, I took a slightly different route, hoping to get back before dark. But as the sun dropped behind the trees, the forest started to feel different. Colder, more oppressive. I heard noises again. Rustling, something moving just out of sight, quickened my pace. Halfway back, I found more footprints, the same size as before. They circled around me in the dirt, as if someone had been pacing nearby. My heart started to race. I didn't like the feeling of being watched. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, trying not to panic. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was dark and cloudy. I locked the door behind me and checked the windows again. Everything looked normal. I ate dinner quickly and tried to start a fire, but the wood was damp from the rain that had started falling softly outside. That night was worse than the first. The noises were closer and louder. I heard heavy breathing, twigs snapping near the cabin, and something scraping against the side of the building. My flashlight's batteries were running low, and the shadows outside made every sound feel bigger. I didn't sleep well. I stayed awake, listening and gripping the knife. I kept thinking about the footprints and the feeling that someone or something was out there watching me. I wondered if the cabin's cheap price was because it was in a part of the forest that had trouble with trespassers or worse. The next day, I decided to leave early. I packed up quickly, feeling nervous and on edge. Before leaving, I walked around the cabin one last time. Near the back, in the soft earth beside the fire pit, I saw fresh footprints again. They were larger than mine, with deep impressions like heavy boots. They led into the woods, but there were no signs of anyone coming back. I got into my car and started the bumpy drive back down the mountain road. The silence of the forest was broken only by the engine's hum. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the main road and got a cell signal, I called the rental company to tell them I was leaving early. The owner sounded surprised but didn't ask many questions. I told them the cabin just wasn't for me. I haven't gone back to that part of the forest since. Sometimes when I'm driving through the area, I get a cold feeling like I did back then, like someone's eyes are on me from the trees. I don't know who or what made those footprints, but I'm sure it wasn't an ordinary hiker. I've heard stories about people living rough in the woods, squatters or hunters who don't take kindly to visitors. Maybe that's what it was. The experience changed me. I realized that being alone in the wilderness isn't just about facing nature. It's about facing the unknown people who might be out there, watching. The forest isn't always safe, and sometimes the scariest things aren't creatures or ghosts, but other humans you don't know and can't see. Now, when I think about that week, I don't remember the quiet beauty of the trees or the lake. I remember the footsteps in the dirt, the scraping at the cabin, and the feeling of being watched. And I'm grateful I made it out safe. I'm starting that now. It will take a moment to generate a full 7,000 plus word story. I'll provide it all in one go. I want to tell you about the worst week of my life. It all started with a plan that should have been simple, just me getting away from the city to clear my head. No distractions, no internet, no people. Just me, a cabin, and the woods. I didn't know how badly things could go. It was late summer, August 2011. I was 29 years old, living in Minneapolis. I work in graphic design and had just finished a big project at work. I was burnt out. I wanted peace. So, I found a cabin to rent through a small local listing. It was in northern Minnesota, near a small town called Eerie, right next to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. I chose it because it was off the grid, no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just nature. The price was reasonable, and the pictures showed a tiny wooden cabin with a wood stove, a small porch, and a nearby lake. Perfect. I packed my car with camping gear, food, water, and a couple of books. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I didn't want to be disturbed. I left early on a Monday morning and drove the 5 hours north. The highway turned into a narrow 2-lane road surrounded by tall pine and birch trees. The sun was bright and warm, and the sky was clear. I remember thinking how calm everything looked, how quiet it was compared to the noise of the city. I arrived just before noon. The cabin was exactly like the pictures. Weathered wood, a steep metal roof, a rusty screen door that creaked when I opened it. There was a small porch with a single rocking chair. No electricity, no plumbing except a well outside for water, and a small outhouse a little way from the cabin. The lake was maybe 50 feet away, the water dark but clear, with reeds growing along the shore. I spent the first hour walking around, taking pictures and unpacking my stuff. I filled a big jug with water from the well, chopped some firewood stacked near the cabin, and started a small fire in the stove. The air smelled like pine needles, damp earth, and smoke. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That first night I slept well. The sounds of the woods, crickets, frogs, and the occasional bird lulled me to sleep. The cabin was cold, so I kept the fire going until the last moment, then wrapped myself in a thick blanket. I felt good to be away from the city's stress. The next morning I woke early. I had oatmeal and coffee on the porch, watching the mist rise from the lake. I decided to hike a little, following a trail I'd seen near the cabin. The trail was narrow, lined with tall trees and thick underbrush. The ground was soft from the recent rain. As I walked deeper into the woods, the sunlight filtered through the leaves in dappled patches. I didn't see anyone else. The trail twisted and turned, sometimes rising over small hills, sometimes dropping into low valleys with little streams. After a couple of hours, I came to a clearing with a small abandoned fire pit and some scattered ashes. There was no trash or other signs of recent visitors. It felt like a forgotten spot. I turned back, trying not to think too much about how isolated I was. When I got back to the cabin, I spent the afternoon reading and fishing from the lake's edge. The weather stayed clear and warm, perfect for being outdoors. But as the day passed, a strange feeling started to settle in the pit of my stomach. A mix of loneliness and unease I couldn't explain. That night, I tried to push it away. I kept the fire in the stove burning strong and ate some canned soup. Around 10 p.m., I went outside to the outhouse. The sky was full of stars, and the moon was a thin silver crescent. I heard the faint rustle of movement in the woods nearby, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I told myself it was nothing, but then I noticed something else. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves, coming from the woods just beyond the tree line. It wasn't constant, but it didn't stop either. I stood very still, straining to hear, but the sound was too faint to tell exactly where it was. I decided to go back inside and lock the door. I sat by the fire for a long time, trying to calm my nerves. I told myself I was imagining things, but deep down I felt watched. The next day, things started to get worse. I woke to a loud banging on the cabin door. My heart jumped into my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked outside, but no one was there. The door was old and rickety, but it was locked tight. I checked the windows. They were shut. I stayed inside all morning, listening for any other sounds. Nothing. No birds, no animals. Just silence. After lunch, I went back to the lake to fish again. The water was calm, the sun warm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I returned, I noticed the firewood pile was disturbed. Logs that I had stacked neatly were scattered, some pieces broken. I was sure I hadn't done that. I took the axe and rearranged the wood, trying to convince myself it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or a bear. But I didn't hear any growls or animal calls. That night, the banging on the door returned, louder and more aggressive. I didn't open it. I sat in the corner of the cabin, clutching a heavy metal flashlight I brought for emergencies. The door shuddered under the blows, but it held. Around midnight, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I stayed awake until dawn, listening for any more noises. The third day, I was too scared to go outside much. I tried calling on my cell phone, but no signal. I had no way to reach anyone. I rationed my food and water, trying to stay calm. I spent most of the day pacing inside, watching the woods through the windows. I kept my axe nearby and tried to light the stove as often as possible to keep the fire going. The cabin was cold, and my nerves were shredded. In the late afternoon, I heard footsteps again. Slow, heavy, pacing around the cabin outside. I peeked through the window. There was no one there, but I could hear them clear as day. The footsteps moved in a circle around the cabin, sometimes stopping for minutes, then continuing. My mind raced. Was someone watching me? Waiting? Planning? I wanted to run, but the nearest town was miles away, and my car was parked near the main road. Not here. I was trapped. That night was the worst. The banging returned, this time with scratching sounds mixed in, like nails scraping wood. I grabbed a knife from my kitchen box and sat by the door, ready for anything. I stayed awake the whole night, too scared to even breathe deeply. When morning came, I was exhausted, shaking, and covered in sweat. The door was scratched up badly, deep gouges in the wood, like claws or a sharp tool. I checked the windows. One had a cracked pane, probably from a heavy hit. I knew I couldn't stay, but I was afraid to leave. I decided to wait until noon, when the sun was highest, hoping the person or people outside would be gone or less likely to approach in the daylight. Around 10 a.m., I heard voices, low talking just beyond the tree line. I couldn't make out words, but it sounded like a group of men. My heart pounded. I was terrified. Suddenly, a rock hit the cabin wall, hard. The thud shook the whole cabin. More rocks followed. I ducked down, covering my head. After what felt like hours, the voices and noises faded away. I waited until noon, then decided to try to get to my car. I packed my bag with what I needed: water, some food, the knife, and flashlight. I took a deep breath and stepped outside. The woods were quiet. The sun was bright, and shadows were sharp. I moved quickly toward the road, eyes scanning the trees. My hands trembled as I gripped my bag strapped tightly. Halfway to the road, I heard footsteps behind me, fast and heavy. I broke into a run, heart slamming in my chest. I didn't look back. I made it to the road and to my car, shaking so badly I could barely open the door. I locked myself in and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. In the trees, I saw figures standing and watching. I didn't stop until I was back in town, safe. I never went back to that cabin or the woods around Eerie. I told no one for years. Even now, I get chills thinking about it. What I learned was simple and terrifying. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. Sometimes they're just people. And when you're alone, out in the woods, no one can hear you scream. I'm safe now, but that week changed me. I never thought a simple trip for peace could turn into the worst nightmare I've ever lived. The cabin, the woods, the silence, they still haunt me. Not because of anything supernatural, but because I came face to face with real fear. The fear of being completely alone, vulnerable, and at the mercy of unknown strangers. That's the kind of terror you don't forget. I still remember the moment I first saw the cabin. It was early autumn, late September of 1998, when I decided to take a break from my usual routine. I was 28 then, working a tiring office job in a small town near the outskirts of Vermont. The days were getting shorter, and the crisp fall air was beginning to settle into the trees. I had been craving some solitude, a break from the constant noise and stress, so I rented a small cabin tucked deep into the Green Mountains, about 15 miles from the nearest town called Brattleboro. The cabin itself was an old, two-story wooden structure built sometime in the 1940s. It sat on the edge of a thick forest, with a narrow dirt road leading up to it. The road was hardly used, winding through the trees, covered in fallen leaves and scattered rocks. I arrived late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to lower behind the hills. The place had no electricity or running water, but it had a wood stove and a well outside. I liked the idea of disconnecting entirely, away from phones, radios, or anything electronic. Pulling my old car up to the small clearing where the cabin stood, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no insects buzzing, nothing but the wind rustling the dry leaves on the ground. I remember feeling a strange emptiness in the air. Not quite bad, but odd, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I shrugged it off as the late hour and the isolation. After all, this was what I wanted. The cabin door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the smell of old wood and dust mixed with a faint scent of mildew. It wasn't what I expected, but it was charming in a rough way. The living room had a stone fireplace, 2 worn armchairs, and a small kitchen area with a rusty sink and cabinets. Upstairs were 2 small bedrooms with single beds and a rickety staircase. I unloaded my bags, stacked firewood near the stove, and lit a small fire. The first night was peaceful, apart from the usual creaks of an old building settling and the distant sounds of the forest. I slept in the larger bedroom upstairs, windows open a crack to let in fresh air. I had brought a sleeping bag and a flashlight, along with a stack of books and some canned food. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. No distractions, no interruptions. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a gentle breeze shaking the branches outside. Sunlight filtered through the tall trees, casting dappled shadows on the cabin walls. I made a simple breakfast of coffee and toast using a small camping stove. The whole place felt quiet and still, like I was the only person alive for miles around. I decided to take a walk down the old road, curious about the area. The forest was thick, with towering maples, birches, and pines. The leaves were a mix of gold, red, and orange, already starting to fall. The ground was soft with moss and damp leaves. I walked for almost 2 hours, noticing how the silence pressed on me more than the woods did. No birds sang, no squirrels scurried, just the occasional crack of a twig beneath my boots. Something about the place felt empty, like life had been drained from it. On the 3rd day, I began to feel restless. The loneliness was starting to weigh on me. I tried reading and writing in my journal, but my mind kept wandering. I decided to explore further down the dirt road, hoping to find signs of other cabins or maybe a small trail leading out. After about a mile, I found a small clearing with what looked like an old, abandoned campsite. A rusty fire ring, a few broken bottles, and flattened grass. Nothing recent, but the place gave me an uneasy feeling. On the way back, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints in the dirt road. They were fresh, I was sure. The soil was soft from a recent rain, and the prints were clearly human, maybe size 10 boots. They headed toward the cabin from deeper in the woods. My heart quickened. Who else was out here? I didn't see anyone, but the footprints told me I wasn't alone. I hurried back, locking the cabin door behind me. I tried to tell myself it was probably a hunter or another camper passing through. I was alone but not isolated from the world. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. The fire in the stove burned low, and the room grew cold. I stayed awake longer than usual, staring into the shadows cast by the flickering flames. Somewhere outside, I heard the snap of a branch. My mind jumped to the footprints I'd found earlier. What if someone was watching me? I shook the thought away. The 4th day came with thick fog. The forest was hidden beneath a gray blanket, and the dirt road vanished into white nothingness. I felt trapped inside the cabin, unable to see more than a few feet out the windows. It was unsettling but also peaceful in its own way. I stacked more firewood and cleaned the cabin a bit. Around midday, I decided to fetch water from the well outside. I grabbed the old metal bucket and walked to the small clearing behind the cabin. The well was a simple wooden structure, covered with a faded tarp. I lowered the bucket slowly, feeling the weight as it filled. When I pulled it up, the water was dark and cold, but clear enough for drinking. As I turned to head back, I caught a movement in the fog. a shadow shifting between the trees. My breath caught. I stopped moving, listening. Nothing. I forced myself to keep walking. Back at the cabin, I double-checked the locks and windows. That evening, the unease settled deep in my chest. The silence was no longer comforting but suffocating. I lit the stove and sat near the fire, hoping the warmth would chase away the creeping thoughts. The fog had not lifted. Outside was a thick, ghostly white. Then, I heard something unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path leading up to the cabin. Slow, steady, deliberate. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The steps stopped just outside the door. I pressed my ear against the wood. No sound except my own breathing. I debated whether to open the door or call for help, but I had no phone, no way to call anyone. The nearest town was miles away. I kept quiet, waiting, hoping whoever it was would leave. After a long minute, the footsteps retreated, crunching back down the road. I stayed frozen until they faded completely. Only then did I exhale and check all the windows once more. Nothing seemed disturbed inside. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat awake with the fire, too alert to rest. The fog stayed thick outside until dawn. On the 5th day, the sun finally burned through the mist. The forest looked different, less oppressive, more alive again. I wanted to believe I had imagined the footsteps, the shadow, the strange feeling. I spent the day walking and exploring, hoping to shake the fear. But the fear didn't go away. Back at the cabin late afternoon, I found something terrifying. A crude message scratched into the wood of the back door. The letters were jagged and uneven. "You are not alone." I stared at it, my hands shaking. Whoever had been near the cabin wasn't just passing through. They knew I was there, watching, waiting. I considered leaving right then, packing my things and driving back down the road to town. But the car's battery was dead. It had been raining the previous night, and the cold weather had drained it. The nearest help was miles away. I was stuck. For the next 2 days, I stayed inside, windows shut tight, curtains drawn. I barely ate or slept. Every noise outside made me jump. The rustling of leaves, distant animal calls, even the creaking of the cabin itself. The fear twisted into paranoia. On the 7th day, something changed. I heard voices, not loud, but clear enough through the walls. Men talking low, near the edge of the forest. I grabbed my small pocket knife and crept to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. The fog was back, heavy and swirling. Through the mist, I saw a group of 3 men. They looked rough, dressed in old work clothes, carrying backpacks and gear. They didn't seem like hunters or campers. Their faces were hard, serious. They didn't notice me. I realized they had been the ones leaving the footprints, the ones watching the cabin. But why? What did they want? I didn't have any way to communicate or call for help. I had to get out. Over the next 2 days, I planned my escape carefully. I watched the men's patterns, noting when they came and went, their routes through the forest. They stayed mostly near the northern edge of the property, rarely approaching the cabin directly during daylight. On the 9th day, I waited until early morning, before the men were awake or moving. I packed a small bag with essentials, some food, water, matches, my jacket, and slipped out the back door. I stayed low, moving quickly through the trees, following a faint game trail I had spotted earlier. The forest was dense and dark, but I kept moving, stepping over roots and rocks. The cold autumn air filled my lungs. After hours of hiking, I finally heard the faint hum of a road. When I reached it, I followed it down the hill, praying it would lead me somewhere safe. At last, I found a small I was 35 when I decided to spend a long weekend alone at a cabin deep in the northern woods of Minnesota. It was the fall of 2017, and I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship. I needed a break from people, from traffic, from my phone, from everything. I booked the place through a small website that listed off-the-grid rentals. The pictures showed a small, rustic log cabin surrounded by dense trees, with a dirt path leading down to a quiet lake. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, no television, just a wood-burning stove, a bed, a small kitchen area, and a dock out back. It seemed perfect. I left early Friday morning from Minneapolis and drove for nearly 5 hours, most of it on smaller highways. Eventually, I hit gravel roads, then nothing but dirt. My GPS quit working about 20 minutes before I arrived. I kept driving deeper into the forest, relying on a printout of the directions. By the time I saw the cabin through the trees, I felt like I had traveled back in time. No power lines, no other houses, just trees in every direction. I parked beside the cabin and stepped out. The air was cold and clean, and the wind barely moved. Leaves crunched under my boots as I walked around the cabin. Everything looked just like the pictures. There was a small fire pit in front, a pile of firewood stacked neatly under a lean-to, and a narrow footpath that led to the lake behind the cabin. I walked inside. The door creaked, and the place smelled like pine and old wood smoke. It was simple but warm. The floor was slightly uneven, and the windows were small, but it had everything I needed. I unpacked quickly. I had brought a few days' worth of food, a stack of books, some notebooks, and a flashlight. The cabin had a propane stove and lanterns. I lit one and set it on the kitchen counter. The silence was complete. It was like putting your head underwater. No hum of appliances, no distant cars, not even birds, just stillness. That first day was uneventful. I hiked the trails nearby, gathered some kindling, and made a small fire out front as the sun dropped. By evening, the temperature dropped quickly, and I went back inside, lit the stove, and sat in the worn armchair near the front window. I read for a while, then climbed into bed under a pile of thick quilts. I woke up once in the middle of the night. It was pitch black, and I could hear something outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunching sound, like someone slowly walking through dry leaves. I held still, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. The woods were full of animals. I eventually drifted back to sleep. Saturday morning was quiet again. I made coffee on the stove, ate a granola bar, and took a long walk around the lake. I didn't see another soul. No boats, no planes overhead. Just the occasional ripple in the water. When I got back to the cabin, I chopped a bit more firewood and cooked lunch. I tried journaling, but my mind kept drifting. Something felt strange. Not threatening exactly, just off. Like I was being watched, though every time I looked out the window, there was nothing but trees. That night, I built another fire outside. I sat on a log near the pit and watched the flames. The forest around me turned black as the sun went down. I kept hearing little snaps and rustles in the trees, but I couldn't see anything. I stayed out there until I felt too exposed. I went inside, locked the door, and double-checked the windows. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up again. This time, I heard something that made my stomach tighten. A dull thud against the side of the cabin. Not loud, but distinct, like a shoulder brushing the wall or maybe something heavier. I sat up and listened. Another thud, closer to the back wall. I slid out of bed and crept to the window. I couldn't see anything in the dark. I picked up the flashlight, clicked it on, and shined it through the glass. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I stood there for 10 minutes, waiting. No more sounds. Eventually, I climbed back into bed, but I didn't sleep well. Sunday was colder. The wind picked up and made the trees groan. I felt uneasy all day. I kept thinking about the sounds from the night before. I walked around the cabin, looking for footprints or marks, but the ground was covered in leaves and pine needles. Nothing looked disturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to regret coming out here alone. I decided to leave a day early. I packed up my gear, loaded the car, and left a note in the cabin's logbook explaining I'd had to cut my trip short. As I started the drive back out, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I couldn't explain why. It was just a growing tension in my chest. About 15 minutes down the road, I saw something ahead. A fallen tree blocked the path. I stopped the car, got out, and walked up to it. It was a thick trunk, freshly snapped, maybe from the wind the night before. But something about it didn't look right. The break was too clean, and the rest of the tree looked healthy. I walked around it and checked the ground. There were faint tire tracks in the dirt, too fresh to be mine. Someone had driven around here recently. I cleared a path around the tree by pulling aside smaller branches. It took almost an hour, but I got the car through. I drove faster after that, wanting to get back to paved roads. I kept thinking about the sounds at night, the fresh tree fall, the faint tire tracks. Once I reached a small gas station near a town. I stopped and called my brother. It was the first time I'd had a signal in days. I didn't tell him everything, just said I'd cut the trip short. When I got home later that night, I unpacked and checked the news. Nothing unusual in that area. No reports of break-ins or missing people. Just quiet, remote forest. Still, I kept thinking about it. A few days later, I emailed the owner of the cabin to thank them and let them know about the fallen tree. I never heard back. Not once. I tried again a week later. No reply. Eventually, the listing disappeared from the site. I haven't gone back since. I still think about it sometimes. How quiet it was. How I never saw anyone. How something kept me up at night. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I was spooked from being alone. But it didn't feel like that. Felt real. Like something or someone didn't want me there. I've stayed in plenty of remote places since then, but I always check the surroundings more carefully. I bring better gear. I let people know exactly where I'm going. And I haven't gone alone again. That weekend taught me something I can't unlearn. Nature's silence can hide anything. And sometimes the most dangerous thing out there isn't an animal. It's a person who knows you're alone. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin up north in Wisconsin, far from the city noise and my cluttered apartment in Chicago. I had just turned 35, and work had been grinding me down more than usual. I worked in logistics, mostly dealing with supply chains, and while it wasn't the worst job in the world, it came with its fair share of late nights, pointless meetings, and that constant stress that never seemed to let up. I needed space. I needed quiet. So I went online, found a small private cabin listed by an older couple who said they were semi-retired and just wanted to make some money renting their place out. It was in a wooded area a few miles off the main highway, near a place called Iron River. It sounded perfect. The drive took longer than expected. Traffic out of the city was brutal, and by the time I passed Green Bay, my back was stiff and my head throbbed from the constant sound of tires on asphalt. But once I turned off onto the smaller roads, things quieted down. Trees grew thicker, taller. It felt like the deeper I drove, the more the world fell away. By the time I reached the gravel path that led to the cabin, I had to shut off the radio. I didn't want anything breaking that silence. It felt thick, like it had weight. The cabin itself was basic. A single level with a deck that wrapped around the front and one side. The wood was dark with age, and though the listing had mentioned it had been built in the 70s, it looked like it hadn't seen much attention since then. Inside, there was a small kitchen, a sitting area with a wood stove, a bedroom with a double bed, and a tiny bathroom that barely fit a standing shower. No TV, no Wi-Fi, barely any cell signal, just what I wanted. The first day went by quietly. I unpacked my cooler, set up the books I brought, and took a long walk along the trails behind the cabin. The air was thick with pine, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional rustle of squirrels. That night, I cooked a frozen lasagna in the oven, cracked open a beer, and sat on the deck as the sky turned a deep purple. Felt good. My muscles relaxed. My mind finally slowed down. The second day, I hiked deeper into the woods. There were old logging trails barely used, and the further I went, the more overgrown they became. I carried a compass just in case and wore a bright orange vest for visibility. I didn't see another soul all day. I liked that. I liked the feeling of being entirely alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and the distant sound of wind. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed the back door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it. I always lock doors, especially when I'm alone. I figured I must have forgotten, brushed it off, and double-checked all the locks before going to bed. Still, I left the light on in the kitchen. On the third day, I stayed around the cabin, read a book, cooked breakfast, stacked some firewood. Around mid-afternoon, I started hearing something odd. It sounded like a low buzzing, faint and hard to locate. I thought maybe it was some kind of insect nest nearby, or maybe a generator in the distance. But every time I walked toward the sound, it seemed to move. It wasn't constant either, came and went. That night, I woke up to a loud thud. It wasn't close, but it was deep, like something heavy landing on the forest floor. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. Nothing followed. I stayed like that for an hour, staring at the ceiling, ears straining. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again. The next morning, I found footprints near the back of the cabin. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were much larger, heavier. They looked like hiking boots, but the tread was deeper than what I wore. They circled the back wall, then vanished into the brush. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe a hunter passed through. Maybe someone else rented a nearby cabin. But I hadn't seen another car or person since I got here. I tried not to let it get to me. I'd wanted isolation after all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching the cabin. I started noticing things, small things. A pine cone placed neatly on the deck railing. My firewood stack knocked over. My hiking boots moved slightly from where I had placed them. I began checking every door, every window 2 or 3 times before bed. On the 5th day, I went to town. It was a small place with a gas station, a diner, and a grocery store. I stocked up on more food, bought some batteries and a cheap motion sensor light. I didn't tell anyone what was going on. Felt stupid to say out loud. Just nerves, I thought. Just being alone too long. But that night, as I sat in the darkened living room with only a lantern on the coffee table, I heard something outside, not far off. Footsteps, slow and careful, crunching over dead leaves. I turned off the light. My heart pounded. I waited. The motion light came on. A soft flood of white lit up the side of the cabin. Nothing moved. I crept to the window and peeked out. Nothing. I left the light on, slept with a knife under my pillow. The 6th day was cloudy. The air felt heavy. I went for a short walk but couldn't focus. Every sound made me tense up. I kept looking over my shoulder. That evening, I sat out on the deck with a pair of binoculars, scanning the woods. At one point, I caught sight of something, a flash of blue, faded denim maybe, just beyond a tree about 100 yards out. When I looked again, it was gone. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed on the couch, facing the front door, wrapped in a blanket, holding the flashlight and knife in my lap. Around 3 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it was right up against the cabin wall. Slow scraping like metal on wood. I froze. My mouth went dry. When the sun came up, I went outside. There were fresh marks on the wall. Long scrapes, maybe 3 feet high off the ground. Deep enough to take off the top layer of wood. I backed away and decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything fast, tossed things into my bag without organizing them. I was out of there by noon, driving back down the gravel road, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. When I got to the highway, I felt like I could finally breathe. I didn't report it. What would I even say? There were no faces, no names, no damage beyond some scratches and weird signs. Just a feeling that I was being watched, and the sense that whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there. I still think about that week sometimes. I never went back to that cabin. I never rented a remote place again. I still love nature, but I keep my hikes to public trails now, places with people nearby. And whenever I hear a noise outside my apartment window, especially late at night, I freeze for just a second longer than I used to. The owners emailed me a few weeks later to ask how my stay had been. I didn't reply. I wanted to pretend it never happened. But part of me still wonders who was out there in those woods, and what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night. One fall night, my buddy and I ended up having a wild, eerie evening deep out in the forest. His family's cabin, a narrow old house, sat all by itself with no other homes around for miles. That night, we decided to do something creepy, mess around with a spirit board. It was close to midnight, probably around 11:40 or so. The woods were pitch black as we sat around the board trying to reach out to something from the other side. To our shock, the little pointer started to move on its own. It spelled out the name Tyler, who happened to be the boyfriend of the friend I was visiting. Things started feeling tense after that. We asked the spirit what it wanted, and slowly, letter by letter, it gave an answer that made us both nervous. The message it spelled out was deeply disturbing. For some reason, it claimed it wanted Tyler dead. It actually spelled the word DIE, clear as day. That freaked us out enough to quit right away. We ended the session and said goodbye like the rules say you're supposed to. Even though we were rattled, our interest in the paranormal just got stronger. We figured maybe we could get another message, this time by slipping a note under the door of one of the unused rooms in the house. We wrote a short question and left it there, hoping for a reply. To our surprise, we got one. Someone or something had written back, and once again, it was a message full of hate directed at Tyler. Now we were really spooked. We decided to try and clean the place spiritually, hoping to get rid of whatever dark presence was causing this. It clearly wasn't a good sign that the spirit seemed to want someone hurt. Around 3:20 a.m., I decided I'd had enough. I told my friend I was heading out. He walked me out to my car, which was parked about 30 feet from the porch. I got in, backed out, and began the long drive away from that creepy place. About 10 minutes later, when I was close to a fork in the road, maybe 4 miles away, my phone buzzed. It was a video call from my friend. I picked up. His voice was shaking. He asked if I'd come back to the cabin. Confused, I told him no. I'd already been driving for a while and was nearly 5 minutes from the house. That's when he told me something I'll never forget. He said he could hear my voice, right outside the front door, begging to be let in. Couldn't believe it. To prove I wasn't there, I turned my phone camera toward the road in front of me, showing I was nowhere near him. Still, he said he heard me plain as day outside his door. He brought his phone close to the front door so I could listen. What I heard chilled me to the bone. It was my voice. It sounded just like me, talking softly, asking to be let in, saying there was something dangerous out there. The voice kept saying it needed help, that something in the woods was after it. My friend didn't open the door. He knew something wasn't right. Then, the voice turned harsh, angry, loud. It started shouting. It even screamed, not just once, but several times, as if it had turned into a group of voices all screaming at once. Like the thing outside had split into several versions of me. The voice then tried a new trick. It cried like I was hurt and lost in the woods, calling out for help, trying to get my friend to come outside, still using my voice. I sat in my car, frozen. I didn't know what to do. I just listened through the car's speakers, unable to stop whatever was happening. After a few minutes, the noise faded. The fake voice went silent. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't talk much either. Even now, we don't really understand what it was. But we both think it happened because we messed with something we shouldn't have, all because of that board. A little over a year ago, I moved my family and me to a new place out in the woods of North Carolina. I want to keep this short, but I really need to get this off my chest. After digging into this a bit more, I have lots of details that I think will help make the whole thing clearer, so please be patient with me. The nights here can get very loud. Between the crickets, the tree frogs, and cicadas, it can almost be too much. One evening, not long after we had moved in, I realized I forgot something in my truck and went outside to grab it. The first strange thing was that my dog didn't want to come out with me. She normally follows me everywhere and I'm her whole world. But that night, she just stood at the door, looked out, then looked back at me like, no. So I went out alone and closed the door behind me. The second odd thing was the silence. It was completely quiet. No animals, no bugs, nothing. I shrugged it off and walked down the porch steps toward my truck. When I was about 10 feet from the vehicle, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like something was watching me. I looked around but saw nothing. After reaching in my truck to grab what I forgot, I got the feeling something was moving closer. I stepped back and looked around carefully. Suddenly, one of the bushes lining the walkway to our front door shook. It first, I thought it was just a rabbit I scared. There had been rabbits nearby earlier that day. Then, a few seconds later, I heard a large rock hit the walkway a few feet from me and bounce into some shrubs. I pulled out my pistol and shouted, "Whoever's there is about to get shot." After a few quiet seconds, nothing happened. I figured it might be some local kids messing with new neighbors, so I put my gun away and started heading back to the house. Almost immediately after I turned around, I heard a deep panting sound. It was like a huge dog breathing heavily, but the weird part was that it sounded right behind me. I jumped onto the porch, turned around, and raised my gun, expecting to see something. But again, there was nothing. A couple weeks later, I was sitting on the porch with my wife at night. She went inside to get something, and as soon as the door shut, I heard that panting sound again. I couldn't see anything, but it felt like the sound was all around me and very loud. Again, no sign of anything, so I went inside. At this point, I was questioning why we moved here, but nothing else really happened, so I let it go. About a month later, on a rainy, stormy night around 9 p.m., my wife and I were enjoying the sound of the rain. I grew up in Oregon and love rain, and for the last 10 years we lived in Arizona, where rain is rare and heavy but brief. For my wife, who grew up in Nevada, rain was also unusual, so we liked listening to it. That night, things took a strange turn. As we were sitting and talking, my wife suddenly stopped me and asked, "Did you hear that?" I said, "No," she said. "It sounded like a small child calling for help from the woods next to our house." She didn't hear anything else, but I didn't hear anything either. After a few moments of listening closely, she said, "There it is again." I told her, "I don't hear anything. Are you sure you're not imagining it?" She looked offended and said, "No, I'm sure. It sounded like our son. He might be lost out there." I reminded her our son was inside asleep on the couch, and we both looked through the open blinds behind us and saw all our kids lying inside. "That's so strange. I swear it sounds like him," she said. "Well, it isn't him," I said. "Besides, I don't hear anything." She stood up and said, "Wow, he's really crying out for help. I need to go look for him." Now, if you knew my wife, you'd know she's terrified of the woods and wouldn't even walk in them during the day, let alone at night during a storm. I grabbed her hand and said, "I've been listening really hard and there's absolutely nobody calling for help. You need to stay here." I was really worried. She was acting weird, and she was about 8 months pregnant with our baby daughter at the time. She said, "What if there's a child lost in the woods?" I told her, first, I would hear them too. Second, there aren't any kids around here for miles. And the chances of a kid being lost just a few feet from our house, which is well lit, are basically zero. She said, "I know, but what if it's a kid?" Before I could say anything else, she stood and started toward the stairs. I jumped up, grabbed her hand again and said, "No, you're not going out there. Please get inside. I don't know what's going on, but you need to be inside." She listened and we both went inside. I didn't know what to think, but it really freaked me out. A few months later, just as the sun was going down, I heard our front door open. I got up to check. We have 7-year-old autistic twins, and we've set the door so they can't open it without us. So whoever opened it had to be my wife. What was weird was that she usually wouldn't go outside without telling me. I walked out and saw her heading down our private driveway toward the side parking spot. I asked what she was doing. She said she had been sitting on the back patio and kept hearing a baby crying from the woods. I said, "Seriously? And you just walked off into the woods to check?" She looked toward the trees and said, "See, there it is again." She said she couldn't hear anything else and that it was completely silent around. I told her, like before, the chance of a baby being in the woods outside our house is tiny, and you need to come back in. "What if someone left the baby out there?" she said. "Well, if that were true, I would hear it too," I replied. At that point, I started worrying about her mental health. I actually asked her to see a therapist, and she did. Looking back now, I feel bad about that, especially knowing what happened next. The key moment was that my wife had just had our baby girl about a month before. A few days later, we were outside on the porch in the early evening. I had just mowed the lawn, and our 4-year-old son was driving his little toy car around the yard. He knows he's not allowed to go past a certain point we marked off. We keep a close eye on him because the road is only about 50 feet from the house, and a lot of careless drivers speed through after drinking all day on their boats. While we were talking and watching him, a neighbor stopped by for a quick hello. The whole thing took maybe 10 seconds. They asked how we were, we said good, and they said they'd come by later with something for the kids. Then they left. I looked back and saw our son was gone. I called his name and ran to the side of the house. I could hear his toy car there. I scolded him for leaving the marked area, and he babbled in his toddler language, pointing toward the woods behind our house. I told him, "You have 5 seconds to get back here or else," but he kept pointing toward the trees and trying to tell me something. I looked in that direction and figured he had just seen a deer or squirrel and wanted to get closer. I walked him back to the front of the house, and he cried the whole way. He was very upset I wouldn't let him go into the woods. I just thought it was normal kid curiosity. This wasn't an isolated event. Our twins have done something similar, but not as extreme. There have been nights when we just lay down to sleep and suddenly heard a loud bang on the side of the house, the wall behind our bedroom. It was so loud I jumped up and looked out the window. Our floodlight came on, but I saw nothing. The strange thing is our bedroom is about 12 feet above ground because we have a full basement made of cinder blocks. I put on my slippers, grabbed my 12-gauge shotgun, and went outside to check. It was dead quiet again. The floodlight had turned off by then. I walked to the end of the deck, shining my flashlight around the yard. There was nothing. I circled the house, shining the light carefully. When I reached the back, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like something was watching me. I shone the light up into the trees, but still saw nothing. When I turned a corner, I noticed my 3 dogs nearby were silent. Our dogs usually bark nonstop at anyone, even me, so seeing them cowering quietly with their tails tucked really worried me. Suddenly, the crickets and frogs started making noise again, like someone flipped a switch. I went back inside and told my wife I hadn't seen anything. She just shrugged and said, "Okay, as long as the dogs are okay." Because of that night, I let the dogs in and slept with them inside. This has happened on all 4 sides of the house randomly. Every time there's nothing outside. There have also been times inside the house when I was watching a movie and my wife said, "Did." I was at my grandmother's cabin way out in the countryside. The only way to get there is a dirt road that's almost completely worn down, so without a good vehicle, you can't reach it. My cousins lived in a trailer with their moms just below my grandma's place. We used to play all kinds of games, mostly involving me running away because I was the youngest. My grandmother was in the hospital with my aunt, so our oldest cousin, Jay, had to watch us. Jay was, and still is, the only older cousin we really respect. He would joke around with us but cared about us a lot. We spent the whole day playing outside, but at night we usually played more. Things like hide and seek or tag. That evening, we were playing quite far from the cabin, and the sun was starting to set. We decided to head back and grab some flashlights to play manhunt. Of course, I was the one being chased. I ran deep into the woods on the far side of the land and hid behind a fallen tree. I heard my cousins getting close, so I sprinted away, but they spotted me. We ran nearly to the back edge of the property, almost a mile from the cabin, and saw Cousin Jay standing there. He looked at us in a strange way, almost like he was growling. We all took off, thinking it was part of the game. When we reached the dirt road, we saw him step out from the trees, but his movements were odd, like he was showing off. We dashed inside and decided to block the door to mess with him. We moved some things in front of the door and then pushed the big coffee table against it. While dragging it, we made a lot of noise. Jay came into the living room from the master bedroom, rubbing his eyes. We had clearly woken him up, and he was annoyed. We told him about seeing him chase us, and he got really wide-eyed. He told us to go to our room and stay there. We sat in the bedroom for about 20 minutes. Then he came back and told us not to be afraid, that it was just him trying to scare us. After that, we continued with the night. It wasn't until about 3 years later, when I was 13, that he finally told me the truth. He said it was a skinwalker. He explained that he had faced it when he was our age and then shared his story with me. Maybe I'll tell it someday, depending on how much interest there is. This is only one of many stories.